When Emilione turned 24, she somehow moved to another reality. When she opened her eyes and looked around, she saw a completely different world. Her clothes were different, her hair turned pink, and the iris of her eyes turned red. Behind her, she saw a multitude of clerics kneeling before her. A young man at the front greeted her and called her the grace of God. The girl soon realized that upon arriving there, she had become Saint Emilione. And that became a problem for her, because even with her acting talent, it's impossible to become a saint overnight. She tried her best, and after 6 months of learning from her own mistakes, she was recognized as a saint to a certain extent. Thanks to that, Emilione had the opportunity to visit the palace. One day, she arrived a little early because she wanted to walk in the garden and noticed 2 people talking. One of them was Duke Ronald Nestro's daughter, and beside her was the son of some marquis. The topic of their conversation was clearly fascinating, as Ronald seemed full of admiration. To everyone, she is kind and beautiful. If this world were a novel, the Duchess would be the protagonist. At first, Emilione envied her, as there were always many handsome men around Ronald. But now she is even glad she didn't fall in love with one of those guys surrounding the young Duchess. Everyone adored that girl, and the protagonist was in love with her. Because of that young man, a true saint lost her mind and ended up becoming a villain. But now Emilione has no time to think about men, because she has a lot to study. Besides, the difference in how men behaved around her and around Ronald was evident. But our heroine didn't expect much, as the knight's attention wasn't directed towards her. The young man made a proposal to Ronald, and she promised the duchy would cover all expenses. But Edel objected, and holding out a book to her, asked her to consider it a sincere gift. Even so, the duke's daughter insisted that something like that must be paid for mandatorily. In any case, she was happy. She would soon meet the crown prince, but she didn't want to leave Lord Etwop. Watching the two, Emilione noticed they were flirting shamelessly. However, looking closely, she realized that, on the part of the duke's daughter, it was just a ruse, and she became very curious to know what show Lady Ronla was putting on. Emilione left there and couldn't stop thinking about it almost the whole way. Later, she met with His Highness, who had previously summoned her, and now, without even greeting her, he coldly asked her to sit down, and this annoyed her a bit. To her, he is just some guy who thinks he's superior for being Crown Prince Cassidra Macron Basilil. Although he was very handsome, she felt a little sorry that his personality didn't measure up. The prince spoke about a hunting competition organized by the royal family, which will be held soon. Afterwards, there will be a banquet, and Cassidra asked her to participate, since Ronla wishes it so. Everything seemed clear, but Emilione wanted to hear the reason from the prince's own lips. Recently, His Highness informed the sanctuary about the increase in monsters, and the competition will be held over a large area. And since Ronla is concerned about the prince's safety, she wants the saint to be near him. From the way he spoke about the duke's daughter, it seemed like he was deeply in love with her. Emilione remembered again that just a minute ago, she was near another man. Her smile was quite sweet, but she can probably hide very dark plans behind it. The prince begged the saint to respect Lady Nestro's wishes, knowing that she never frequented such places. At that moment, His Highness even smiled, which Emilione found extremely strange. Refusing the proposal could bring about dire consequences, and the young woman, reluctantly, accepted. Immediately after, his face returned to seriousness, and he dismissed the saint, as Ronla was about to arrive. Mentally, Emilione disapproved of the Duchess. She hadn't even gotten rid of one, and she was already running to another. Upon leaving the crown prince's room, she saw Helio Rastoon in the hallway, the thinker of the great empire. It had been a long time since they saw each other, and in fact, it was the first time they coincided in the palace. Emilione was happy to see him, and she knew that Lady Nestro had summoned him for a meeting. It was peculiar that the duke's daughter was meeting with His Highness, but surely something had happened. Apparently, it was shocking news for Helio, as Ronla had only called him. The boy's reaction was very revealing, and the saint tried to calm him down. She even felt pity for the boy. But now, Emilione clearly understood that the image of the sweet lady, whom everyone falls in love with, is just a mask. She could have told Helio the truth, so he wouldn't have empty illusions. But it was much more interesting for the saint to observe how Ronla pretended than to interact with a truly sincere person. Later that night, Emilione felt very tired and decided to go to bed, but thoughts kept swirling in her head. After all, the house competitions would soon start, and the young Duchess might be plotting something else. Closing her eyes, Emilione felt something strange. She saw a future shown to her by the local god. It was almost dinner time. The girl decided to get up, but her body refused to move. But what she saw wouldn't leave her alone, as if she had seen a horrible nightmare. Her vision could well be compared to a nightmare, as it foresaw that a monster would appear at the competition. Not long ago, a terrible event shook the county of Sartène. Monsters were sighted. Fortunately, they managed to control it in time. The knights used commoners as bait. This allowed them to defeat all the monsters. But the people used as bait died. But nothing else was expected from the count. For him, the good thing was that they defeated the monsters, and there were fewer poor people. Emilione was disgusted by this world, that applauded and admired such actions. Moreover, they did this after a prophecy revealed to them by the saint. That night, the young woman had a vision for the second time. And again, she predicted the appearance of monsters. Monsters are beasts of chaos, very dangerous to people, but they have a weakness: divine power. That is why the sanctuary is responsible for exterminating them. But the problem is that there is little information about these creatures. It is unknown how many there will be or their level. Ordinary knights could handle the low-level ones, but the others only with divine power. Emilione thought about reporting the monsters to cancel the house event, but they would use more bait. She didn't want that to happen again, and she doubted they would cancel the tournament because of it. She would observe first, and now she was even grateful to have been invited to the event. At that moment, High Priest René Ben returned to her, and the girl asked him to wait a little, so she could put something on. Then she opened the door and the High Priest, as always, greeted the saint. He left for business, with Emilione's permission, and managed to return for dinner. The girl liked that he was so loyal, and suggested they go to the dining room. They walked in silence for a while, but René Ben couldn't stop looking at the saint. Noticing his gaze on her, the girl asked what was wrong. The boy felt embarrassed and assured her that everything was fine, but Emilione was already interested and started asking where that man had gone during the day, since he seemed very worried when he came to ask permission to be absent for a moment. Then, René Ben confessed that Lady Naster had called him and proposed to him, and for the thinker to participate in the competitions. It didn't seem serious to the saint, although she worried a bit upon seeing the high priest's haste. And she worried because Lady Naster had never called him first. It seems Ronla has charmed the high priest too. This becomes much more interesting for the saint. She was curious to know who the only winner capable of conquering Lady Nestro's heart would be. The next day, while Emilione was having a small meeting, Ronla visited her. She didn't tell the maiden the exact reason, only that she wished to meet with the saint. Her appearance was sudden. She didn't even bother to give advance notice. However, Emilione agreed to receive her, and asked for her to be taken to the hall and offered tea. A short time later, she arrived with the duke's daughter, who immediately greeted the saint. Making a sad face, she apologized for her sudden visit. Then she confessed that she needed to talk to the saint about something very important that didn't directly concern her. Therefore, Renéven, who had come with Emilione, could stay. Ronla would feel even calmer if that young lord was nearby, as this topic is very hard for her. The saint looked at her with a languid gaze, guessing that this lady was plotting something again. Afterwards, she accepted her request and asked her to tell what was troubling her so much. René Ben offered a handkerchief to the lady, who confessed that terrible things had been happening to her lately that made her cry. The reason for this is that someone had started threatening her. Recently, while going for tea with Lady Kyrand, she suddenly found her knights murdered. This incident seemed quite strange to Emilione, and Lady Nestro didn't understand what kind of oddities were starting to happen around her. Her things started to disappear, and sometimes she would wake up in another room without any of the maids seeing anything. Ronla spoke so convincingly that it was hard to tell if she was acting or telling the truth. And recently, she was assigned reinforced guard duty, as her father is very worried about all this. The criminal has not yet been caught, so Ronla came to ask the saint for help. At that moment, she looked at Emilione with eyes like Shrek's cat, and anyone else would have given in without hesitation. But the saint suspected something murky was going on here, although she decided to play along with that young woman. Even more so knowing the prophecy about the monsters, so she can handle this without problems. The saint agreed to protect the duke's daughter for a couple of days and search for the culprit. Joy lit up Ronla's face instantly, and she added that she only needed protection. Her father would take care of the rest. And it was decided that Emilione would take charge of the case from tomorrow until the start of the tournament. With this, their conversation ended, and the saint asked Renee Ben to accompany Lady Nestor. The duke's daughter went to find the high priest towards the exit. At that moment, Emilione noted how a malicious smile crossed the face of that beauty. However, she showed nothing and decided to see what happened next. She was even amused by this acting game, in which she had now also been involved. The next morning, the saint arrived at the duchy, where Ronla received her joyfully. Behind her, the duke and duchess appeared, asking their daughter to control her emotions and manners. Ronla apologized and greeted the saint appropriately. Emilione also greeted them, but she did not expect the girl's parents to come out to receive her. But they couldn't do otherwise, as the saint had traveled so far for their daughter, and they asked her to feel at home. Ronla, without hiding her joy, took the saint by the hand and invited her inside the house, and promised to take good care of the guest while she was there. Once inside, accompanied by Ronla and the maids, Emilione observed the place a little. Expensive framed paintings hung on the walls, and there were statues, just as the young woman imagined. But something caused her great curiosity at that moment. The duke's daughter looked different. Yesterday she was desperate, and the saint confessed that worried her. Ronla explained that today she felt much calmer, as she had a protector by her side. With the same falseness, Emilione returned her smile. She knew Ronla was acting, but based on her parents' reaction, there was reason to worry. Possibly something threatened the young duchess, and perhaps she saw an opportunity in this. The saint still had time, and was willing to observe more to discover the truth. Then they invited her to lunch, and she couldn't stop thinking about what that beauty was plotting. The saint found it a bit boring. She wasn't used to seeing Ronla alone, without men around. Suddenly, the duke's daughter asked the saint why she was so active. The atmosphere felt quite uncomfortable, and Emilione did not rush to answer. Ronla, playing innocent, explained that she was just asking out of curiosity. She noticed that Emilia was very different from previous saints. And she wasn't the only one. When the protagonist arrived in this world, she was treated quite well as a saint. But the treatment of the sanctuary was terrible. Since the people there were born with divine power, they possessed extreme goodness. That is why they were never in an advantageous position, even if what belonged to them was taken away. For Emilia, life in the sanctuary was a middle ground between abstinence and poverty, and unlike previous saints, she began to improve the temple system. Before, she explained in meetings why she was doing it, but now she clarified to Ronla that it was to save the sanctuary. But Ronla didn't understand why the saint kept acting this way, now that the sanctuary was thriving. She even felt like the saint was hiding something important. Emilione let out an easy chuckle. Then she admitted that greed had dominated her a little. At the same time, she was more than sure that if she kept trying hard, everything would improve greatly soon. While discussing this, she watched the young duchess's reaction and continued her speech, trying to avoid further questions from arising. At that moment, the young duchess's hand tensed slightly, as if something wasn't going according to plan. The saint became convinced she was right in her suspicions. In a short time, the house competitions would begin, and the job of protecting Ronla would come to an end. During the time she spent with this girl, Emilione noticed nothing that could threaten her. She didn't know how the duke's investigation was going, as they hadn't spoken about it, but it seemed like everything was stalled. But Ronla's reaction was somewhat strange, so the saint decided not to let it go. Emilione decided to send a priest to help with the investigation. Immediately, the people got agitated as an imperial carriage arrived, and Prince Casadora stepped out of it. The girls fluttered with excitement, ecstatic over his handsomeness. Then, Lady Nestor stepped down from the carriage, leaning on the hand the prince offered her. The girls who had previously admired the prince were surprised that he came with the duke's daughter. Following the imperial carriage, another one arrived that Emilione found familiar. A young man emerged from it, whom Lady Nestor immediately paid attention to, and she ran to greet him, happy that he had come to the tournament. His name is Anisis Cashin. He is also a duke and Ronla's childhood friend. And from his look, Emilia knew instantly that he too was hopelessly in love with that beauty. Along with the thinker observing from the side, there were already 4 men interested in Lady Nestor. Emilia decided to observe them, when suddenly Ronla spotted her. The people around also noticed the saint and were surprised, not understanding why she was visiting such a place. And despite Ronla still attracting stares, Emilia greeted her politely. At that moment, Anisis approached Lady Nestor and reminded her that she had to give him the talisman handkerchief. According to custom, when a knight leaves for war, his beloved gives him her handkerchief. With this, she blesses him and wishes him a victorious return. Ronla extended the handkerchief with violet embroidery, a color Anisis loves. Then she started tying the handkerchief to his wrist, as usual, and he, entranced, did not take his eyes off her. Meanwhile, Emilione noted that the handkerchief was already tied to the prince's sword. Cassidra approached Duke Cashin and reminded him that it was time to leave, as preparations were finished. Behind them, Ronla smiled sweetly and waved her hand, wishing them a victorious return. Both young men thanked her and headed towards the horses. The young duchess occupied the waiting time, chatting trivialities with other ladies. And the saint stayed aside. And suddenly she heard someone shout furiously, spurring a horse and approaching her. The next instant, one of the knights fell at her feet. He was scared and his breathing was ragged. The young woman asked him to calm down and tell her what had happened. And swallowing air greedily, with a voice trembling from agitation, the knight released the terrible news. He recounted that the prince was attacked by monsters, and Emilione understood that her prophecy had come true. A tense hysteria instantly took hold of the atmosphere, and the saint reproachfully reminded them that they must avoid casualties at all costs. The knight apologized for the bad news, but the girl softened her tone, saying it wasn't his fault. It is believed to be a mid-level monster, and most of those who went are injured. Emilia asked for the exact location to send reinforcements immediately. Suddenly, they saw Lady Nestro running at full speed towards the forest, while the panting knight watched the Duchess run. The saint also shot off after Ronla, who was clearly pursuing her own ends. Apparently, she was counting on the saint to cover the rear, and was surely plotting something. Upon reaching the indicated place, Emilia smelled a nauseating odor of blood. Ronla was already next to the prince, insisting that the saint would arrive soon, and they would take care of the monster. Cassidra asked the Duchess not to worry, and her ability to speak indicated that his wounds were not so serious. The prince heard someone approaching, and, instinctively thinking it was the monster, he threw a dagger in that direction. This dagger, by pure chance, lodged in a tree next to the saint's head, slightly scratching her cheek. The prince realized, with some delay, that he had been mistaken, and the Duchess was quite disconcerted. The wound on the saint's cheek was not significant, but the young woman felt pain. But despite this wound, Ronla began to beg pitifully for her to heal his highness. Approaching, Emilione noticed that his wounds were much more serious, and was surprised he was still conscious. Bringing her hands close to him, she began to heal him, but the recovery was progressing very slowly. So the monster's venom entered the wound, and it started reopening despite the sacred power. Right now, Emilione could only provide first aid and wait for the venom to leave the body. She advised His Highness to return, when suddenly a suspicious noise was heard, and the next instant, behind the saint appeared a monster with long appendages on its snout and vertical jaws. Emilione's life was in danger, and the prince gripped his sword to protect her. He asked Ronla to step aside, but the saint asked him to move even further away, since she was going to fight that monster and save his life. And the body of that monster had many wounds after the battle with the knights, and its speed had decreased due to fatigue. A green liquid flowed from its wounds, the poisonous blood with which the prince was poisoned. Emilione was sure she could handle that monster, and she took off her painted nail gloves. Those gloves look strange in our world, but they probably have such strange fashion there. The beast began to attack her. For her, it was just a simple snack. The girl dodged so that the tentacles wouldn't hit her, nor the acid reach her, or she wouldn't make it. And if that monster corners her, then she will truly be finished. To the side, she noticed wounds on the monster's body, incompatible with life. The beast was also moving towards the prince and Ronla, and while it was struggling, it was an opportunity to attack. Emilione only had one chance to defeat this enemy. Concentrating a cluster of divine energy in her hands, she launched it against the monster. And the next instant it roared, and its body fell to the ground, spraying the girl from head to toe with green blood. Looking at that motionless body, His Highness hoped the monster was dead. To be sure, Emilione kicked the body and confirmed that the beast had indeed died. The saint explained that this monster smells blood, and they were lucky it didn't become obsessed with her. Then she extended her hand to the prince, stained with a green liquid, and suggested they leave there and return to the camp. Cassidra was a little confused. He felt a bit disgusted, touching something resembling goo. But then Ronla made herself known, offering to help His Highness up. And the saint understood that the prince refused to touch her, And this after she had saved his skin. Suddenly, Cassandra grabbed her hand and began to get up. It seemed a bit strange to Emilione, but she decided to keep her sarcasm to herself for the moment. After all, the prince should be wiping Lady Nestro's tears. But he had ignored her. Then, the saint remembered that there were still people fighting the monster, and she called His Highness's attention to the need to attend to the wounded. Ronla interrupted again, insisting that the first thing was to heal the prince. She clung to him like a leech and looked at the saint as if she were a nuisance. According to this world, Nestro was right, but the saint asked them to return to camp, where other priests would help them. Cassandra wanted to object, but Ronla began to drag him, especially since it was her chance to be alone with him. And to convince him, the Duchess declared that she would suffer if he got sick. She took advantage of the fact that he didn't like to see her suffer, and only the saint understood that it was pure theater. But now she wasn't in the mood for that, and again asked those two to return to camp. The prince decided to heed her, but on the way he kept looking at her, and Emilione turned away so as not to watch that circus, and besides, she wanted to take a look around. In summary, the situation was under control, thanks to her bringing many priests. There were no human losses. Only the prince remained to be healed. Upon returning, she witnessed Duke Cashin yelling at Ronla for her actions. The Duchess seemed annoyed and shouted at him not to dare scold her. Emilione, observing, did not understand why the situation had changed like this. A little earlier, Emilione went to the prince and explained that it was all she could do for now. There is still venom in his body, so he will feel pain, but it will pass. She cannot eliminate all the venom now. It requires too much energy. The saint did her best so that the prince would at least not lose consciousness from the pain. She also advised him to visit the sanctuary from time to time. He would recover faster that way. His Highness was thoughtful, as now the imperial family would be indebted to the sanctuary. In the end, he accepted Emilione's proposal. It was a small surprise for her. Then she asked Lady Nestro to help His Highness. He needs to be watched during the visit to the sanctuary, and Ronla is perfect for that role. The young Duchess seemed to be waiting for this, so she smiled and gladly accepted. Then she started cooing at the prince, that under her care he would recover very quickly, and she promised to stay close so he wouldn't be bored. It was evident that Ronla wanted to strengthen her position with His Highness, as he will become emperor. But if she marries Cassandra, she won't be able to keep dreaming about the harem he has now. While Emilione was drawing conclusions about the young Duchess, Anisis entered the tent very upset, and in a raised tone, he started shouting at Ronla for her action. He obviously meant that she fled alone into the forest, and he feared something might have happened to her. She replied by shouting that she couldn't stand by while the prince was in this situation. Besides, she was convinced that the saint would follow her immediately. Emilione did not want to get involved in these disputes and asked everyone to calm down, as the prince needed rest. Duke Cashin understood his mistake and immediately blamed himself with His Highness. On the other hand, Ronla should not be judged, as she ran to the aid of the future emperor. And Cashin getting so angry meant that he was very worried about the young Duchess. However, looking at Anisis and Helio at that moment, you can tell they are jealous of her. The tense situation was broken by the announcement that His Highness's guard had arrived, and Emilione was preparing to leave, leaving the prince in Ronla's care. But she begged to return with the saint and thanked her once again for saving His Highness. Now the saint was in a dead end, not understanding why this person does not want to stay alone with him. She looked at Cassandra, waiting for the final word from him, and he asked Emilione to do what Lady Nestor asked, which greatly pleased the Duchess. On the way, Ronla didn't stop thanking the saint and pretended to worry about her wasted efforts. Furthermore, she admitted that Anisis was right and that she shouldn't have risked her life and gone into the forest alone. Even so, she believed until the end that the saint would appear at the right moment like a miracle. And so it was. Emilione was starting to get annoyed by this, and she explained that she was simply doing her job, but she didn't shut up and promised to give the saint whatever she wanted as thanks. As soon as she asked for it, the Duchess acted simply brilliantly, and had she arrived at the duchy only in the first few days, she wouldn't have noticed the hostility. But now she realized that almost all of that lady's words were lies. Ronla then worried that the banquet would be cancelled, but she understood that celebrating in that situation was not appropriate. On the other hand, she still has many concerns, and besides, her brother should arrive soon. Lady Nestro's brother is the heir to the duchy, and Emilia only knows about him that he is studying abroad. Ronla also promised to invite the saint when her brother returns after finishing his studies. They are going to organize a family reunion, and with that, the lament for the banquet cancellation will instantly fade away. The saint could accept, as she had no other pending matters, given that the banquet will not take place. Moreover, Duke Nisus should come, but she was not sure if he would accept after the unpleasant conversation in the tent. Although, considering his attitude towards the Duchess, he might show up to try to make amends. After that, Emilia accepted the invitation, adding that she would come with her personal assistant, who, according to her, will try to stand out at dinner, since Ronla didn't pay attention to him today. Unexpectedly, the young Duchess confessed that her brother is a mage. But at that moment, the cart shook violently, and the girls understood that they had had an accident. They suffered a bit from the jolt, and while trying to recover, a man approached the cart. The sun behind him prevented seeing his face when he looked inside, and only his silver hair was visible. Then, with one hand, he tore off the shattered door, and when he leaned in a little, Emilione could see him clearly. She didn't know this man, but she was outraged that he dared to disturb the sanctuary's cart. This guy, who noticed the saint, suddenly became curious to know what she was doing there. The saint looked at him like an idiot. It was obvious it was the sanctuary's cart. However, he explained it to her in detail out loud. Then he demanded that she explain who he was and what he was doing there. His face looked familiar to her, but she couldn't recall where she might have seen him. And then he noticed Ronla, who had curled up hiding behind the saint's back. But the expression on his face changed instantly, as he recognized his brother in that man. Both girls were surprised. Emilione could hardly believe they were related. They were so different, and Ronla was a little shocked that he would appear so soon and that they would meet in this way. After all, in front of them was the heir to the Duchy of Nestro. He snapped his fingers, explaining at the same time that he had to arrive a little earlier than planned, and the girls began to float in the air, as if they were flying away from him. He used magic, after which the cart returned to its normal state. The coachman and the horses were fine, and Emilione thought this guy was not hostile. Then she remembered Ronla's parents and noticed that her brother looked very much like the father, and his daughter like the mother. Moreover, it turned out that the brother and sister had a quite good relationship. But something bothered the saint, who closely observed their unnatural smiles. She understood that both scoundrels were acting, pretending something that wasn't real. Ronla then asked why her brother had attacked her carriage, and he explained that he smelled a monster. And the saint remembered that she was still covered in monster slime and blood. Even so, this guy's actions seemed exaggerated to her, and introducing herself as the saint, she made it clear that she was in a bad mood now. Varan Nestro offered his deepest apologies, realizing he had acted rashly, and in response he received another reproach, that he should investigate everything first and then use force. Ronla also apologized after her brother, hoping to calm the saint's anger. Both Nestros showed their courtesy, as if they had rehearsed a while before. Ronla was even going to follow her brother, to emphasize their good relationship. Emilione did not dissuade them, especially since now she has time to think everything through. Back in her chambers, the saint decided to relax a bit in the bath, and the prince's dagger wound still hurt. And at those moments, she didn't want to be a saint. Even though she concentrates a large amount of divine power, she couldn't heal herself. The only good thing was that her recovery speed was faster than others. Emilione didn't understand why she felt pain, and Varan also worried her a little. He smelled a monster, and only people with divine power can do that. Anyway, the girl didn't want such a situation to repeat itself in the future. Moreover, she was a little annoyed that the prince didn't even thank her after she saved his skin. And not to spoil her mood further, the saint continued cleaning the monster's blood. She was glad to have dealt with the beast, even though everything was dirty, horrible, and at times terrifying. Later, René Ben appeared, whom she had asked to come, and she handed him an envelope, begging him to deliver it to the imperial palace. It contained documents about the monster that injured the prince. The saint had figured everything out in advance, as she knew the emperor would ask to obtain all possible information about this case. After this, Emilia allowed her assistant to go rest, but he was in no hurry to leave, and informed her that he had received another letter from the palace. It said that, instead of the cancelled banquet, they were preparing a celebration in honor of the saint. This is thanks for saving the crown prince, who will hardly participate, as he is still sick. The girl paused to think for a moment, and the high priest thought she did not wish to participate in the event. But suddenly, she accepted and asked for her decision to be reported to the palace. The celebration will be at the palace, and if Lady Nestor shows up, she will probably drag her harem there. For Emilione, this was a chance to have fun, so she decided not to let it pass. After a while, the sanctuary administrator, Lewin, came to see the saint and reminded her it was time to get ready. The young woman was a little surprised by such haste, since the event would not start until the evening. But Lewin became indignant, saying the saint still had to bathe, put on makeup, and choose a dress. Then she started pushing Emilione towards the bathtub, carefully of course, but wanting her to obey. The girl understood there was no malice in that woman's actions, but it was noticeable that something had changed in her. At first, she tried to avoid the saint even with a glance, and now she acts like another nanny, which showed that Emilione had completely integrated into the sanctuary. After a while, Renaven was waiting for the saint, as they were going to the palace together. He knew preparations would take time, but it seemed to him they were taking too long. And while killing time looking out the window, he heard her voice behind him. Turning around, Renaven saw Emilione in front of him, very beautiful, and was left speechless. She only gave him a modest compliment, telling him that he also looked good today. Suddenly, the priest found his voice again, and also praised her appearance. He was pleased to accompany such beauty. He even felt happier than a prince. He worried about the saint, as she always avoided these events. In the forest, he felt that something had deeply disturbed her. Emilione was surprised by his restlessness. She thought he was only thinking about Lady Nestor. Now, she only apologized for causing him concern and asked him not to think about her today, but rather to concentrate on himself. She, on the other hand, was eager for the upcoming event. They arrived at the palace, and in the main hall, their arrival was announced. The saint had never participated in anything like this, nor did she think she would. But now she is here, and upon entering the hall, silence reigned. They were surely talking about the sanctuary, as many aristocrats hated it since she became a saint. But she acted precisely, so that the sanctuary would receive its deserved share. Some believed that she stole the money that should have gone to their own pockets. But now, Emilia decided not to think about that, and offered Renaven a seat. It turned out they arrived a little early, so the opportunity arose to rest. And observe, soon Lady Nestor and Duke Anisis Cashin were announced. Ronla was beautiful and charming as always, but the Duke also looked splendid today. A dark-haired man approached the saint, and bowing, declared that he was entirely at her disposal. The girl didn't know who he was, and Renaven whispered in her ear that he was the second son of Count Macho. This young man also participated in the hunting competition, but it seems the saint did not recognize him. And it was not surprising, as a misfortune occurred and she was busy helping the knights. The count understood and thanked her for honoring his subjects with her attention. He smiled, but Emilia also saw arrogance and a disgusted look on his face. And evaluative. She disliked this guy, and when he proposed a dance, the saint refused, and politely told him to go jump in a lake. To ensure he moved away, she took Renaven by the arm and proposed taking a walk. This, naturally, deeply hurt the count's son. No one had dared to reject him like that. He wanted to retort, but Ronla and Anisis, who approached the saint, prevented him. A conversation about life trivialities ensued between the girls, and Duke Cashin looked angrily at Machio, signaling him to leave and not try again. Emilia noticed that many were now paying attention to them. When she was only with Renaven, no one spared them a glance. But as soon as Ronla and the Duke approached, the attendees swooped in like bees to a hive. Then, Anisis expressed his gratitude to the saint for that time, as he didn't have the chance back then. And bowing deeply, he thanked her for saving Ronla. His behavior showed he was not against the sanctuary, or he was hiding it very well. Still, Emilione noticed that this man looked at her like an adversary for some reason, although maybe it was just her imagination. Furthermore, her attention was once again drawn by the young duchess. And while Ronla was chattering, the saint heard a strange sound and had a bad feeling. But she still couldn't figure out why the atmosphere had changed. Then, the expensive crystal chandelier under the ceiling began to shake. Even some candles went out. Everything indicated that this lamp was about to fall. And so it did. Duke Cashin barely managed to shield Lady Nestor from the heavy lamp. Renaven wanted to pull the saint away so she wouldn't get hurt, but she stopped him and instead focused her attention on the young duchess. But the lamp was already plummeting towards the floor at full speed, and Emilione barely managed to dodge it to avoid being crushed by the iron and crystal. A shard lodged in her hand, but she quickly removed it so as not to worry Renaven, who was panicking, and she wanted to assure him that almost nothing had happened to her, when suddenly she felt something strange, and the next instant she felt a kind of nausea. But she still asked her assistant to examine the lamp. She wanted to know if there was anything unusual about what happened, and she didn't let Renaven examine her wound. The saint's request was an order for the priest, and he could not disobey. Meanwhile, panic broke out among the guests upon seeing that some had indeed been injured. Obviously, shards flew everywhere, and the lamp hung right above the crowd. Helio was nearby and looked with horror at a scratch on his hand. Although his fear was greater than the wound itself, the saint approached him to heal him. Placing her hand on top, she directed a bit of divine power to the scratch, and his skin looked intact again, as if nothing had scratched him. Seeing this miracle, others also began to ask the saint for help. Fortunately, they did not have serious injuries. Emilione decided to perform a similar healing for them and asked them to calm down. Only now did she stand before the crowd and apply healing to everyone at once. The wounds on their hands disappeared instantly, and the guests were especially glad that not even scars remained. When she finished with the crowd, Emilione turned to see if the Duke and Ronla were all right. Although they were initially at a safe distance, it was worth making sure just in case. Then, Renaven approached the saint and reported that at the spot where the chain broke there was a strange trace, as if it had been intentionally cut. He didn't find the tool used to do it and suspected magic. Moreover, monster poison was found on many crystals from the lamp. Now Emilione understood why she felt dizzy and nauseous. That's how monster venom affects her. Even so, it seemed strange, as when healing others, she noticed no signs of poisoning in them. Meanwhile, the people rejoiced at having been healed by the saint. Suddenly, she demanded silence by shouting, saying that the lamp fell right above her head. The girl clearly implied that it was a deliberate act, motivated by contempt for the sanctuary. Therefore, she declared that from that moment on, the sanctuary would cease its monster extermination activities. This means that, from now on, they will have to fight monsters using only physical strength. Many were displeased, as there are very powerful monsters that only priests can defeat. Marquis Mitra approached Emilione and begged her to calm down. He is the most powerful man among all the aristocrats of the empire, and besides, the decoy idea was his. Now he asserted that the saint was just scared by the falling lamp and asked her to maintain composure. He reminded her that monster extermination is the primary task of the sanctuary. But the saint disagreed, explaining to him alone that she, as a saint, is the owner of the sanctuary. She is the one who hears God and brings abundance and peace to the empire, and decided to stop the warehouse for the people. Agitation began among the aristocrats. They did not understand what this meant, and the saint explained that due to their treatment of her, God would punish them, and she did not want that. Emilione decided to punish those little people herself and leave them without the sanctuary's support, which is better than being punished by the heavens anyway. The Marquis disagreed and declared that, in that case, there is no reason for the sanctuary to continue existing. But the saint clarified that it would only be a pause until the culprit who attempted her life is found. She is sure that even the emperor will agree to investigate and does not believe it was an accident. Of course, the Marquis feared that they would not find the culprit, and then the sanctuary would never resume its work. The girl declared that before the party, everything must be reviewed, and the emergency lamp surely would have been noticed. After this, the Marquis collapsed, but the saint was not satisfied and declared that, as God's vicar, she would punish all the aristocrats for their inappropriate behavior. At that moment, in a corner, a young man with long silver hair secretly observed the unfolding events. Emilione left the palace, and upon returning, her housekeeper worried about her wound. The young woman asked her not to make a mountain out of a molehill and to bring her a bandage. She understood that if the lamp had crushed her, she would have been unconscious for at least 3 months. And the idea that someone was loose somewhere, attempting to take her life, terrified her. She thought about going abroad when René Ben knocked on her door. He himself brought her the bandages, besides which he needed to talk to the saint. Mustering his courage, the priest declared that Emilione acted recklessly today. Moreover, his duty is the saint's safety, and he should have protected her. He regretted that Emilione was injured, and now blamed himself for not watching her. René Ben's worries were understandable, but the girl only wanted peace, especially after what happened. And just as René Ben opened his mouth to speak, she put a candy in it, asking him not to say such things anymore. Since they exhausted her, she understood that the boy felt guilty, and if they didn't resolve it, he wouldn't be able to sleep peacefully. Suddenly, Renee Ben's face contorted because of the candy. The taste was pleasant, but it was herbal and smelled strange. Still, he forced it down. Then the saint offered him a seat and asked him to think about how people would react if what happened today had happened to the prince. People are not very fond of hierarchies, but only the duke reacted quickly and protected Lady Nestro. And the saint, who was in the most dangerous area, was neglected, although she is above the duke's daughter. Like the knight Anesis protected Ronla, but no one blamed him because no one values the sanctuary, that resource that rushes to help at the first call. That's why Emilione restricted the people, to show how pathetic they are without the sanctuary. As for high-level monsters, there is no need to worry for now. They appear once every 100 years. But if one like that appears, the saint is willing to make an exception and handle it, so that it doesn't harm the common people. Above all, there is no law prohibiting her from doing that. Marquis Mitra was talking to his assistant. He felt depressed and angry at the same time. He was furious that Emilione, who appeared out of nowhere, became a saint and now dictates terms. He saw her as a child who appeared a year ago, but acting alone will be difficult for her. And on top of that, the aristocrats do not stop requesting monster extermination. The Marchioness is driven mad by the saint believing herself superior and swore she will pay for it. Meanwhile, requests are also being sent from the sanctuary, as if ignoring the saint. They still haven't found the criminal who cut the chandelier. Even though the imperial family promised to handle that investigation, Renaven went to see Emilione, and she noticed he was exhausted, as if he hadn't rested. But he was thinking more about the state of the saint, who is exasperated by all those aristocrats. Moreover, there is now a risk that the sanctuary will suffer economic losses. Emilione perfectly understood that the sanctuary must help those in need. Renee Ben reminded her of this right now, adding that he was not going to argue with her order. But the girl understood the concern of the man with innate divine power, so kind. However, she wanted the aristocrats to reconsider their attitude towards the sanctuary and their actions. On the other hand, when Emilione stopped the monster extermination operation, the priests, who had been working tirelessly, could finally rest well. She sent the rest to the slums to deliver provisions and attract the sick and orphans. Emilione asked the high priest not to feel guilty in front of the aristocrats, and not to forget the common people, whom those noble people cause so much harm to. Renaven didn't forget it, which made the saint see that he was ignoring him. But it was clear to him that the aristocrats were pressuring him with their constant complaints. The common people couldn't have an opinion, and Emilia didn't want that to leave a bad impression. From now on, more people would come from the slums, and the sick would not be left unattended. Emilia had her own explanation regarding the orphans. In memory of the deceased, she prepared a small place inside the sanctuary to care for the orphans. Now she wanted to find a place outside the sanctuary, and was even thinking of building a special orphanage. The orphan children would stay there until they reached adulthood. All this will also have to be legalized so that there are no problems with taxes and other expenses. This also gives her the opportunity to review tax amounts across the entire empire. Although she doubts the emperor will allow it, Emilia decided to try. The young woman thought that this was the main purpose of the god who had redirected her to this world. Renee Vane's reaction to her intentions seemed a little strange at first, but then he declared that, from now on, he would strive even harder and promise to give his all. The high priest's emotions soared, although the saint was happy about his responsibility. Later, she went to the library and stayed there reading books late into the night. She loved being in the library more than anywhere else in the sanctuary, because in this room there are many romantic books. Probably those who maintained this place had tastes similar to Emilione's, and that made her happy. She pulled out a book called Monster Love and found it most intriguing. It's strange for a book with that title to be in the sanctuary, but that didn't stop her from starting to read. The story began with a monster being born in a forest a long time ago. It observed people and reflected, studied their food and clothing. And one day, it possessed the body of a beautiful girl. It arrived in the village, but adapting to the human body was difficult, so it stumbled and fell to the ground. Suddenly, a man appeared and helped the girl up, and they fell madly in love, but fate played a trick on them. The man was a priest, and the girl's life was in grave danger. One day, the sanctuary managed to discover the true nature of the priest's beloved. They ordered him to kill that creature, but he couldn't bear to watch his beloved die. So he decided to flee with her. But deceiving the sanctuary proved impossible. The priest, now a fugitive, died saving the monster girl, passing away in her arms. The girl lamented being a monster and not a person like him, and the story ended tragically. It was difficult for Emilione to accept that a monster could think and express feelings of love. Perhaps it is right that the sanctuary judges these so they do not harm people. Leaving the book, the saint went to Renee Ben, who was also not asleep yet. He didn't expect to see her. The boy even jumped, and she scolded him a little for overdoing it. Then she became curious about what kept him so absorbed there. In the document, she read that Count Basin, who abused girls, was acquitted. The saint understood that her assistant was gathering information about criminals. This will help her overthrow the rotten aristocrats and reduce taxes. After this, His Majesty will not object, and her opponents will only be the aristocrats. Renee Ben knew some of them well, and couldn't believe they were involved in crimes. Emilione understood that it was hard for the priest to punish even sinners due to his kindness. Once again, she begged him to think of the victims of those crimes. Renee Ben must not feel guilty, but wish for those villains to burn in hell. Because of this, we can no longer ignore the situation as before. Afterward, Emilione thanked her assistant for his good work and told him to go rest. And she herself decided to take the selected documents to the emperor. The next day, the saint announced the punishment for the sinful aristocrats and the tax reduction. The emperor agreed to approve the punishment once the veracity of the crimes was confirmed. 2 days later, upon waking, Emilione heard a noise in the street and wanted to go out to see what was happening. On the way, she noticed in the mirror her slightly wrinkled and sleepy face. First, she decided to tidy herself up a bit. Besides, Lewin had come to visit her. Taking the opportunity, the girl decided to find out the cause of the uproar from the sanctuary head, and she told her the rumors that they had caught a criminal who, not long ago, attempted to take the saint's life. Still, Lewin didn't understand why Emilione was behaving like a child with her prohibitions. They would have caught him anyway. Likewise, she suggested going down and seeing with her own eyes. Emilione went down with Renaven, and there she found a crowd of priests and knights. The saint blessed them, then asked them to raise their heads, and they informed her that they had captured someone named Jesse Fautra, suspected of attempting to take the saint's life. Emilione saw that she was chained, and they explained that the girl had resisted. Moreover, they had to use force, and now the girl, seemingly thin, was practically covered in bruises and scratches. The saint did not wish for criminals to be punished like that, and approached the poor thing to heal her wounds. But as soon as I reached out my hand towards her, she began to scream as if she were being killed. Surely, Jessie is still shocked and panicked, so we must hurry with the healing. And only when the divine power began to work did the prisoner finally start to calm down. Her body no longer hurt, but due to the agitation and stress, she fell to her knees. And realizing she had a saint in front of her, she began to beg her for help. Emilione asked Renaven to take the girl inside, as she herself was going to interrogate her. The saint sent away the knights from the imperial palace who brought the prisoner. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice and turning around, saw Duke Cashin. He looked a little worried and begged the saint to spare him a moment. His clothes were torn and dirty because he had recently been fighting a monster. Although his subjects should take care of it, the situation in the duchy changed and he didn't have time to think about it. However, that was not the real reason for his visit, but that the saint herself had asked the emperor to compel the nobles to pay for their sins. The young woman noticed that the duke was very well informed. It turned out that his father was also a sinner, and he was ashamed not to have realized it. Even after obtaining the title, the previous duke secretly abused his power. But it is not as shocking compared to the sins of other nobles. Emilione was a little surprised that Cashin considered abuse of power a sin. And now he came to express his gratitude because the saint had revealed the misdeeds of the former duke. To him, his father was a good man, but he believed any sin should be punished. Now Emilione was convinced that Anisis was truly not a bad person. Furthermore, after his ascension to power, the duchy began to prosper. She asked him not to apologize for his father's sins, as it was not his fault. But Cashin insisted, and he also asked for forgiveness for allowing the saint to get hurt on that fateful day. He meant that he rushed to protect Lady Nestor immediately, instead of saving the saint. And as a knight who did not protect the mistress of the sanctuary, he believed he should also be punished. Legally, he was guilty, of course, but Emilio had no intention of punishing him. Moreover, despite his title, he appeared in person and sincerely apologizes. Therefore, the saint decided to give him a warning and wanted to make sure he would protect her if the situation repeated itself. Suddenly, the Duke fell silent, which made the saint think that his apologies were not sincere. Then, he swore by the honor of the Cashin family that he truly felt guilty before her, although he cannot guarantee that in the future, his decision will be the same as now. The young woman smiled slightly mischievously. Then she confessed that she was not going to punish him, even though his act is incorrect according to the laws of the country. But she completely understands his intention to protect someone more valuable to him, and she didn't want to keep talking about the topic so as not to seem like a nag. Emilione understood that feelings do not always guide one down the path of reason. And since Duke Kasha came personally to apologize, the saint agreed to overlook his action. However, one question gnawed at her and wouldn't leave her alone. Emilione was intrigued to know what attracted him so much to Lady Nestro, and this was her chance to learn the truth firsthand. The Duke first paused to think, as if remembering something, but suddenly became uneasy, as if he didn't know that he liked the Duchess. It seemed like the saint was asking him the reason for his love. How strong, but from his reaction, this man truly doesn't know why. And that surprised her. The only thing he could say was that he liked Ronla just the way she is. As simple as that. Then they said goodbye, and Emilia went to tidy herself up a bit. She needed to compose herself. She was worried about Anisis. Wow. He stumbled over his words and then ran off. After finishing washing up, another priest arrived to collect the used towel. How timely. He thanked the saint for everything. And she asked about René Ben. Where could he have gone? They saw him go to the guest room at the end of the hall. This is getting interesting. And Emilia went there, hearing considerable noise behind the door. What is going on? The uproar was caused by the prisoner Jessie, and the high priest was trying to calm her. But she already had a dagger and a small bottle in her hands, demanding that no one touch her. Upon seeing the saint, René Ben was glad she arrived, as he didn't know how to deal with the enraged prisoner. He simply brought her tea, but it turned out she had a hidden dagger. The little bottle contained scented sleeping draught, which Jessie intended to use to escape. But that did not affect the saint. She was interested in why they hadn't searched the prisoner. This girl was simply brought directly here, and apparently has not contacted anyone other than the knights. Emilione decided this might be useful to them. Then she asked Jessie to calm down, explaining that they were not going to do anything bad to her. The prisoner's hysteria attack did not cease, and she pointed the dagger towards the saint. Suddenly, the weapon simply slipped from her hand and then fell at Emilione's feet, filling the room with a dull, metallic echo. The saint picked up the weapon, while the prisoner panicked, thinking that now she would truly take revenge. The fear of death forced her to beg for forgiveness again, and she promised it would never happen again. And Emilione looked at her enigmatically, thinking about the best way to deal with this girl. Playing around, she raised the dagger, which frightened the prisoner even more. Jessie Ford huddled into a ball and pleaded for forgiveness, genuine terror on her face. But Emilione asked her to calm down and, leaning down, explained that she was not going to cut her. She was curious to know why Jessie, even though she hadn't done anything, had still gone to the sanctuary. The girl began to insist that she was guilty, but the things she carried suggested otherwise, and the way she revealed herself only confirmed that she was innocent. To prove it further, Emilione asked her to explain in detail how she threw the lamp. She was interested in the tool used and demanded that she show the magic she applied then. And since the criminal couldn't explain how she did it, the answer was obvious. Jessie Fatra was not the person the saint was looking for. Probably the imperial family's investigation yielded no results, and they decided to frame someone. Now the saint was interested in who was behind this. They probably threatened that girl, so much so that she insisted again that she was the culprit of everything. She needed to hide the truth and convince the saint of her words, or her parents would be in danger. Emilione grew tired of hearing those cries. She asked Jessie to be quiet and listen to her carefully, because she is sure of her innocence. Besides, her acting is quite poor. The saint also sensed that this girl is very worried about her family. And to calm her down, Emilione asked Renaven to send someone to Baron Fatra's estate. Jessie's parents must be brought to the sanctuary and informed that it is because of their daughter. Turning back to the girl, the saint promised to help her get out of this situation. Hope appeared in Jessie's tear-filled eyes. Emilione also took the poor girl's hand and promised to do everything possible to save her family. After this, Jessie released her true emotions and burst into tears, falling into the saint's arms. Later, Renee Ben knocked on Emilione's door. He heard that Jessie was moved to another room, and the saint confirmed that she was taking care of her right now. Now this girl is not a criminal, but a guest of the sanctuary whom they fed and gave her other clothes. Renevan was not surprised by the saint's kindness and reported that a carriage had already been sent to the baron's estate. Then, Emilione asked him to sit down, as she had another conversation pending with him. To Jessie, she offered candies, so she would feel more relaxed. And yes, they were the same candies she had recently given Renevan. The guest's reaction was the same as the high priest's. The girl almost turned green from its effect. The taste also seemed disgusting to her, and she doubted it was edible. Emilione explained that one had to chew slowly, and Renee Ben recalled his bitter experience. The saint even felt embarrassed that no one who appreciated the candies, as they deserved, had appeared yet. But now it's not about that. When Jessie's face returned to normal, the saint asked her to tell everything in order, and she confessed that lately her family is on the verge of collapse. Her uncle, Marquis Saran, snatched the mine from them, which was their only source of income. On top of that, they inherited his debts. And a week before the banquet, a man offered them money for a favor. He told them that a lamp would fall and that days later, Jessie had to take all the blame. He also threatened that if anything went wrong, her family would be in grave danger. Jessie knew nothing about this criminal, and Renee Ben began to question her about his description. The girl only noticed a mark on his wrist when she took out the bag with the money. It was 2 snakes biting an eagle's wings, and the priests guessed it was an anti-divine cult, a society of dark mages who commit atrocities in secret and do not recognize the sanctuary. And since they always acted stealthily, there was almost no information about them. Emilione suggested that Jessie live in the sanctuary for now, since cultists were involved. It didn't guarantee comfort, of course, because she arrived as a criminal and they would look at her suspiciously. But for Jessie, that was no longer so terrible compared to what she had experienced. Then she thanked them for the opportunity and promised that, under any circumstances, she would be on the saint's side. She also asked them not to address her by her title and promised to help in any way she could. Emilione agreed, when suddenly Renee Ben addressed her and asked that they also treat him informally and with more freedom. It was his sincere wish. This meant they could use the familiar tu form, and Renee Ben confessed that he would feel more comfortable that way. At first the saint wanted to refuse, but seeing his pleading face, she agreed. The following night was supposed to be relatively calm, but as Emilione walked down the hall, unable to sleep, she saw someone she did not expect to find there. Veron Nestro appeared before them, with a strange and surprised expression on his face. The saint noted that he and his sister seemed to have a family tradition, appearing without notice. It seemed even stranger to her that Veron admitted he had no intention of meeting her. He was using invisibility magic, but Emilione still noticed him. And putting on an innocent face, he begged her not to misunderstand him. The saint did not know the reason for his appearance, but she didn't like him coming to her office without permission. Then she began to ask him about the reason for his visit, but Veron looked around and declared that he smelled an odor that was getting stronger. Taking a step closer to Emilione, he extended his hand towards her and stated that the cause was in her. Then he leaned in very close to her, as if subtly sniffing her, but it was creepy. The girl immediately pulled her hand away and reminded him that she had revoked the ban on destroying monsters. But it seemed the young duke was not referring to that. After which, unexpectedly for the saint, he proposed making a deal with her. He didn't explain many details, he just warned her not to touch his sister. But this was problematic, as the saint is responsible for Ronla's safety, and she was worried about her. Veron promised to take care of her problems himself, and asked Emilione not to worry about it. After all, he is the heir of the family, and will be able to resolve it, and he seemed very serious. Without thinking much, the saint took his hand and kissed it as a sign of respect, and declared that she agreed to accept his conditions, but she was interested in knowing how he planned to repay her for this. The saint's question made the duke momentarily disconcerted, but then, in a firm and authoritative voice, he promised he would protect her. Emilione can count on him if danger threatens her. He is a high-level mage. This made her understand that the chandelier incident would happen again, and Veron's offer was good. She gave her consent, but the duke remembered that he must not touch Lady Nestro, and if there is no physical contact, they can see each other without issues. Veron also asked her to call him if she needed him. He himself looks forward to it. The next morning, Emilione overslept, and Jessie and Renee Ben went to wake her up. She opened her eyes with difficulty, as she couldn't sleep well due to the nighttime visitor. However, she had to get up and made an effort to get out of bed. Seeing her state, Jessie offered ice water, and that revitalized the saint. Then, Renee Ben wrapped her in a shawl with a scent of tits, which Emilione liked so much. And the girl loved knowing that the priest remembered that detail and deliberately scented the shawl. Now, so that no one can harm such kind people, the saint must win. Today was an important day. A big meeting was coming up in the hall, and Marquis Mitra arrived. He was furious that the saint had not only threatened him at the previous banquet, but had also stripped many aristocrats of their titles. And today, she was scheming some game with them. The Marquis felt tarnished, but he was determined to keep fighting her. Soon Emilione herself arrived and took her seat on the carved chair, like on a throne. Her place was on a small pedestal, surrounded by a small fence. In the front row of the hall, the Marquis seethed inwardly, humiliated to have to bow to that person. But no matter how much he wanted to cause an uproar, he knew he had to restrain himself. He was sure that today would be the last time she would look down on him, and he greeted her courteously. Meanwhile, he thought about how to get rid of her as soon as possible, believing she threatened the peace of the empire. To do this, he had obtained a potent poison, capable of affecting even a saint. As a result, the temple would lose its beloved saint without understanding what happened, and the Marquis would keep his riches. They had just served Emilione a cup with the drink, to which the poison had been added, and the saint took the first sip, after which Murda couldn't wait for her to kick the bucket. Suddenly, Emilione showed surprise, but her voice still sounded lively, and that unsettled the Marquis, especially because she looked directly at him. And then, wiping the liquid residue from her lip, she announced that she had detected poison in her drink. The hall became noisy, as the high priest had served her the drink. People couldn't believe he was capable of such a thing. Renee Ben turned pale with fear and nervousness, and began to swear he had nothing to do with it. But the saint had no intention of blaming him, and asked him to calm down. Emilione understood that among those present, there was still someone who longed for her death. People began to look at each other, and the Marquis wanted to know why the saint suspected her guests. Moreover, since everyone was in the sanctuary, and the priests had prepared the tea, the other guests nodded, saying that only the priest had access to the drink, so it must be one of them. The tea itself is prepared with leaves from a plant that grows in the garden. It is very likely that the poison was added to the tea during preparation, but the saint did not believe it was the work of the priests or the servants. Although someone could have been bribed like Jessie, Helio intervened and called for calm. The first thing is to make sure Emilione is okay. It is paramount, and she herself confirmed that she is fine, especially with her quick recovery. They decided to continue the meeting. We must find the culprit among the guests. The Marquis was the first to oppose, doubting that a noble would attempt to harm the saint. He didn't understand the thinker's certainty. If no one approached the saint, Helio never heard complaints from the sanctuary about the saint. So the villain is here. He didn't believe it was possible for it to be the work of one of the priests. No way. And if someone added poison without approaching the tea, everyone is a suspect. Automatically, the Marquis looked at Helio, wanting to strangle him with his own tongue. What tension! But he was not going to point out anyone in particular, especially since the saint will have the final say. Emilia noticed that Marquis Mitra had a strange expression, as if he knew something about what happened, but she continued the meeting, declaring that she would not change her stance. She demanded lower taxes and promised that shelters would soon be in every territory. Furthermore, she asked for someone to oppose, and the first to raise his voice was the Marquis. Suddenly, the entire building began to shake, and people panicked. It seemed like an earthquake, and Renaven asked them to look towards the street. The girl immediately approached the window and saw exactly what she suspected. In the courtyard, signs were visible that a monster had appeared. Panic increased. They were on the sanctuary's territory. The saint demanded calm. After a quick count, Renaven reported that there were about 10 monsters. Emilione asked him and the other priests to go outside the sanctuary and help evacuate the people. Although the high priest wanted to stay with the saint to protect her, she explained that if the monsters got out, there would be even more trouble, that the main thing was to save the people. As much as Renaven objected, he obeyed her command. But then the Marquis raised his voice again, and his tone was one of discontent and anger. He demanded that the saint not stand there idly and go capture those beasts. Moreover, He was not asking her for a favor, but reminding her that exterminating them was her duty. People also began to beg her to get rid of the monsters, as there was no one else who could do it. But Emilione turned to Jessie and asked her to tell her the names of the mages and knights who were among the guests. Then she called for silence in the room and asked those whose names would be mentioned to step forward. Many priests are outside, so the sanctuary does not have the strength to deal with the monsters. Therefore, the help of those who can use force will be needed. A wave of panic arose among the guests. They feared and understood that they could die there, especially since these monsters are so huge that they can swallow a whole person. Emilione saw that everyone was scared, but now they had no other option. So the saint, with an authoritarian but hopeful voice, asked everyone to put aside their fear and unite. Cashin determined that the monsters were of a higher level, and they could only distract them and land a couple of hits. For the saint, that was enough. She would personally take care of the extermination. The Duke agreed. Then he addressed the rest not to stand around like stakes and start acting. He sent the knights to the front, then the mages would go. And he reminded everyone that they must obey the saint's order. Still swallowing the knot of fear, they agreed to go fight the monsters. The saint liked how well he managed to control the people and thanked him. He only apologized for intervening without permission, although he doubted they would achieve anything with so many people. However, Emilione reassured him, saying that she would protect them all, and she would send them home. Anisis himself understood that he shouldn't worry because the saint was near, but for some reason he felt uneasy. Soon the battle against the monsters began, and the mages attacked them with special spells. And when the beasts received an energy blow, the knights entered battle to finish them off with their weapons. After each blow, they had to retreat so as not to receive a counterattack from the beast. Duke Cashin also fought among them, warning the saint when it was time to attack the monster. The girl fearlessly rushed into the attack, wondering if the news had reached the palace. In that case, they should send reinforcements, and when they arrive, they can begin the evacuation. Moreover, along with the reinforcement, they will be able to deal with the monsters faster. Emilione noticed one monster in particular, which looked unusual and strange. A large purple mass, resembling a pile of shit, was covered in spines and blisters as if from an acute allergy. However, they finished it off quickly. The remaining monsters, which they hadn't reached yet, began to attack the temple walls. These began to crumble. It seemed the beasts wanted to destroy the structure on purpose. One of the monsters broke in and landed like a giant snot in the middle of the city dwellers. And they panicked. Renee Ben, whom they sent to handle the evacuation, was asking residents to calm down. Emilione got nervous. Now the first thing is to deal with the one that broke through. And then she was horrified to see a terrified child running down the street. Due to fear, the child stumbled and fell, sliding a little on the ground. So that the monster wouldn't catch him, the saint hurried to get the child to safety. A monster also began to pursue Marquis Mitra. The aristocrat was scared shitless. He didn't want to die like that, and so soon. And then he saw a sobbing child on the ground. Without thinking much, the Marquis grabbed him by the neck. He was obviously going to use him as bait. Emilione understood the man's intentions and became furious. The Marquis actually threw the child at the monster to escape while it was eating. Accelerating, the saint jumped high and managed to catch the little girl before she reached the monster's jaws. The monster released its spines, reaching Emilione and managing to scratch her. At that moment, Duke Cashin appeared and split the beast with his sword. It fell to the ground, splashing everything with green blood. But Anisis was more worried about the saint. The young woman fell to her knees, making no sound. In her arms, she still held the little one, who was still whimpering from fear. Emilione couldn't understand how someone could use a child as bait. Before, the Marquis used commoners for that, and he always tried to survive alone. Now he was the most shameless person to her, and she felt the desire to throw him into the monster's maw. At that moment, energy began to form around her, like small lightning bolts floating beside her. And then a blinding flash erupted, blinding everyone who looked at it. Helio, upon seeing this, understood that it was the power that only the first saint had managed to awaken. Some thought it was divine punishment, but Renaven feared that something terrible had happened to Lady Emilione. The shockwave of the flash swept the area, reducing the monsters to small piles of ash. The saint turned to the little girl she held in her arms, hoping she was all right. Duke Cashin ran towards Emilione, distressed in case she had been injured. The saint only managed to ask him to take care of the girl, and then began to lose consciousness. After a while, the young woman regained consciousness, and upon opening her eyes, she saw that it was already night. She found herself in a bed, with bandaged hands, and understood that the sanctuary people had taken care of her. But then, she felt someone standing behind the closed door. Emilione supposed it was Lord Nestro, and when he entered, she asked him how he felt. He appeared as soon as he received the news, and the girl was surprised that he cared about such things. Veron only explained that he could have appeared much earlier if she had called him, as they had agreed, and the saint remembered how he spoke of an increasingly strong odor, as if sensing the arrival of monsters. On the other hand, he himself could be the culprit of everything that happened, but someone like that would hardly come to help, and the girl promised that she would use his services next time. Then the Duke boasted that, using magic, he had restored everything that had been destroyed. The priests checked everything, and there was no trace of the monsters. Veron supposed that the saint had used divine punishment. Since not even the bodies of the monsters remained, they were burned to ashes. Emilione understood that this happened in a fit of her uncontrollable anger, which exploded in the form of sacred power. After thanking the Duke for his help, she decided to find out the details with the priests later. She also found out that Lady Ronla had come, but Renaven sent her away, arguing that the saint was very exhausted and needed rest. Emilione found it amusing, as Renaven is crazy about Lady Nestra, and she was also curious to know what goals Ronla is pursuing now. Although she might think that the crown prince could be here, the saint felt somewhat confused when Veron asked if she also liked his sister, and she explained ambiguously that many people like that lady, because everyone considers Lady Ronla a sweet person and kind, besides being very beautiful. And while Emilione was explaining herself, Veron stared at her, as if studying every movement of her face, and she kept laughing, saying that Lady Nestor was unique and there was no other person like her in the Empire. After that, the Duke decided to leave the saint, explaining that his parents would worry. That sounded a bit strange, since he is already an adult man, and his excuse that he was returning to the estate so late to not bother them sounded even stranger. Even so, the saint thought he had a very affectionate relationship with his parents. Unlike his sister, since the first meeting, Emilione found him a very mysterious person. After some time, the saint achieved what she wanted. She didn't even expect everything to be resolved so quickly. Even the Marquis, who openly showed his displeasure, agreed with her opinion. Obviously, everyone was delighted, and Helios was glad to personally meet the saint who used divine punishment. In ancient records, it says that divine punishment helps to quickly destroy the target. The thinker ignored the details, but only the first saint could wield such power. Now Emilione understood that everyone had been intimidated by fear of her strength. She noticed that Helio still wanted to say something, and he confessed that he had found out about the lamp incident. They told her that traces of poison were found on the fragments, and she immediately identified it, so that the victims would not suffer symptoms of poisoning. And this poison was unusual. Such poison is capable of attracting nearby divine power. It reacts to it. Moreover, magic was used in the preparation process. Therefore, the state of the substance normally does not influence it. It needs the right conditions. And furthermore, this poison can spread, even when in a liquid state. As soon as it enters the danger zone, the person with divine power is immediately affected by the poison. Renaven had no traces of poison, and his recovery is slower. It turns out this is because Lady Emilione's power is superior to that of the high priest. Therefore, the poison only affected her, and it is probably for personal reasons. Now the saint is even more eager to investigate this case, and Helio telling her in person meant that the same poison was used at yesterday's meeting. It turns out it wasn't necessary to put poison in the cup, but to wait for her to start drinking, and at that moment, the villain could calmly declare that the poison was added to the drink. Helio thought the same, and now they must find the bottle so the saint has proof. Yesterday, they couldn't search anything in the chaos due to the monsters, and the criminal could get rid of the evidence. Renaven didn't give up and decided to search the surroundings. Their conversation was suddenly interrupted when the little girl they rescued entered the room. Emilione recognized her instantly, although now she was clean and dressed in a nice dress. The little girl was happy to see the saint again, but Jessie stopped her, telling her it was rude to shout like that. Then she apologized to the saint, explaining that she brought the little girl because she was throwing tantrums. Moreover, this girl wanted to give something to Lady Emilione. The little one found this yesterday, and thought it was very valuable, so she brought it. Then, she held out an empty vial, and everyone guessed it was the little bottle they were looking for. This became irrefutable proof, and Marquis Mitra was sentenced to death. The imperial court discovered that the bottle belonged to him and found him guilty of attempting to harm the saint's life. They also attributed the lamp incident to him, although he denied it. But he didn't even listen, because he wanted to end this as soon as possible. The Marquis got what he deserved, because he was caught at a bad time. Finally, they warned the saint to be careful, because if this continues, anarchy will break out in the empire. For Emilione, this sounded like a real threat. After this, his head rolled from his shoulders, according to the sentence. Emilione hoped something like this wouldn't happen again soon, but decided to train her body. Now she has divine power, but divine punishment consumes a lot of physical strength. This time she didn't faint due to blood loss, but because she exhausted all her body's resources. And if she perfects her fighting skills and the art of the sword, it will be easier for her to resist the anti-divine sect. Emilione hired a skilled knight as a teacher who noticed her innate aptitudes. And in the next class, he promised to show her how to catch her breath. A dog, several times her size, tried to make friends with the little girl. Its name is Chen Ina. He lives in the sanctuary because they haven't found him a family yet. But he quickly adapted to the new place, something not all adults manage. It was this little girl who brought the dog. He was at the entrance of the sanctuary, and she decided to let him in. She loved his fur, but didn't even think he might have an owner. Since no one was around, Chen assumed he was as lonely as she was. She worried the saint might get angry, but she only cared that the dog wouldn't bite. Emilione noticed that the girl had gotten a little dirty, and asked them to call Jessie to change her. She was curious why Chen was alone. It turns out everyone is busy decorating the garden. Everyone was busy preparing for the goddess festival, and Emilione suggested to Chen to play with her friends. At that moment, the girl lowered her head with evident shame, which implied that other children were making fun of her, and the saint felt very sorry for her. But just then, a dog started hovering around them, implying that he himself would gladly play with the girl. Emilione noted the very affectionate and solicitous animal, and when she petted him, he rolled onto his back so she would scratch his belly too. But Chen decided to take care of that. She loved how the dog wiggled its paws and tail in pure pleasure. Then, the girl asked Lady Emilione to scratch his belly too. She hesitated a bit, but finally sank her fingers into his thick, long, and shiny fur, which really turned out to be so soft that now she didn't want to stop petting him. The beast looked clean and adorable, and the girl thought about letting him stay for now. Suddenly, Jessie, very agitated, ran towards her. They informed her that Chen needed her. That's why she was hurrying, and when she saw the dog, she was a little surprised. The girl didn't want to leave her new friend, but the saint explained to her that she had to change and eat. And after saying goodbye to the dog, she obediently followed Jessie. Emilione understood that the little girl wanted to play more with her new friend. But life isn't just about games. Furthermore, the dog most likely has a family that is very worried about him. The saint suggested to the dog that they look for his owners together, but he suddenly ran off somewhere. The girl immediately ran after him and saw that he had escaped to the garden, but had hidden somewhere. And while Emilione was searching for him with her eyes, he suddenly appeared. And with a satisfied look, he jumped onto the saint. He wanted to play with her. The girl wasn't scared. She understood his eagerness, but it tickled her when he licked her cheeks. And while deciding to enjoy the fun with this peculiar animal for a bit, a shadow fell over her. When she looked up, Emilione saw His Highness, who didn't quite understand what was happening there. The girl felt very uncomfortable. He might think that she had forgotten all the rules. The prince didn't like being greeted upside down and grabbed the dog. Then he threw it aside with such fury that the saint was indignant. The excuse was silly. Cassidra thought the dog had entered the sanctuary and was trying to seduce the saint. Emilione wanted to explain to that idiot that it was just a dog, that it only wanted to play. When suddenly she noticed that this dog, after landing, had transformed into a human. A rather handsome young man with dark hair apologized for his behavior. The saint was shocked. She couldn't believe that this gruff guy was the adorable creature she was playing with. Now, instead of a dog, there is a rough guy. Even his hair is a different color. Still, she invited him for tea, and he behaved very gallantly and introduced himself as a turban. The girl felt a little embarrassed in front of the new guest because of how the prince threw him like an old rag. He was from the county of Turvan, and the saint had never heard that someone from there could transform into an animal. Cassandra explained that this beast man is a half-breed. Therefore, he can transform from human to animal and vice versa. Blood mixing is a very delicate topic, so very few people know about it. Emilione understood that Thurbin has a unique composition, but she wanted to know the reason for Cassandra's visit to the sanctuary. It turns out that the crown prince came looking for someone, and he transformed into a dog just for fun. He still found it amusing, but Emilione didn't find it amusing, and that got on her nerves a bit. He still thought it was fun to transform and play with the girl he saw in the sanctuary. He also wanted to meet the saint, but hadn't had the chance until now. But after what happened, the girl now had slightly unpleasant memories, because he pounced on her, and she directly declared that this kind of behavior is considered rude. Thurbin agreed, felt ashamed, and is now willing to accept any punishment. The saint once again found him too frivolous, as if he believed she wouldn't do anything to him. Although if he has truly heard anything about her, he should know that she is not as kind as previous saints. And while a thoughtful silence reigned, the prince decided to reveal the reason for his visit. It wasn't that he came for one. Cassandra was involved in his adventure and handed a small box to the saint. Inside was a handkerchief like Emilione's, which the prince had taken from her in the house competition. The one he took was badly damaged, so His Highness bought a new one exactly the same. Moreover, he wanted to express his immense gratitude for the treatment she received at the sanctuary. For Emilione, it was unexpected that the crown prince had become so considerate, but she would have preferred him to notify her of his visits in advance, and he confessed that Terwin had convinced him. Obviously, they are very close, as the county supports the crown prince. In turn, one blamed Cassandra, saying that he himself was preparing for the visit. He even prepared an elegant box. The prince immediately shut up and promised Emilione that he would punish that beastman. After this, they said goodbye, agreeing to meet at the goddess festival. The saint was happy that this liar from Turban was leaving the sanctuary. One returned with the man he called his king, although he asked him not to do so no one would hear. But the room was under protective magic. Moreover, one brought interesting news. Curiosity invaded the mysterious man, and he prepared to listen to what one had managed to find out about Saint Emilione. Soon the goddess festival arrived, a celebration to thank the goddess and ask for her blessing. This festival is held every 5 years and lasts a whole week. During this period, even warring countries must sign a peace agreement. Many consider this festival very important, especially for the saint. Emilione holds that title, although she is a common person, but at the festival she becomes the incarnation of a god. That is why the sanctuary inhabitants tried their best to prepare her well for the event. At the celebration, not only aristocrats, but also the emperor himself will kneel before her. Despite this, according to protocol, the saint must cover her face. She must not show herself to the commoners. But Emilione decided this time to reject that tradition, because today is dedicated to her, and she wanted everyone to see her. Furthermore, the saint asked the high priest to support her in everything she did today. Many people were preparing to receive her, and among them was a child, who was so mesmerized that he stumbled over a small stone and fell to the ground. But one of the soldiers was only furious about it, as the child blocked his way, and he started pushing the girl so she wouldn't be in the way, insulting her with all sorts of profanities. Emilione witnessed this unpleasant incident from the carriage and ordered the march to stop. The carriage stopped, and the saint, upon exiting, looked toward where the incident occurred. Then, she ordered Renaven to resolve that commotion and bring her the little girl. Immediately, the high priest immediately left to fulfill the saint's demand. Meanwhile, the soldier was still dragging the girl, so furious that he was ready to hit her. He didn't care that she had hurt herself. He was furious that she had ruined his day. But suddenly, René Ben appeared above him on horseback and ordered him to release the girl. Then he explained that because of him, the march had stopped, and that the saint was very upset by his action. To avoid being punished, the man pointed at the girl, saying it was all her fault, and that she had gotten in his way. At this, Renaven warned him and ordered him to return to his post. He obeyed immediately, abandoning the girl just to avoid trouble. And the high priest extended his hand towards the girl and asked her to accompany him. Very soon, along with that little girl, he returned to the saint's carriage and reported that everything was resolved. Emilione looked at the girl's big, frightened and surprised eyes and asked her name. The little one, in shock, remained silent, and when René Ben asked her to answer, she got very scared. Seeing the girl's condition, the saint asked the high priest to be kinder and not demand too much from her. Then she smiled sweetly at the girl and asked her, once again, to tell her name. In a timid voice, the little girl uttered that her name was Devil, and the saint stroked her head. She loved the girl's name, as it means the sacred sound of the bell. This should please the sanctuary people. Although the girl doubted it, as many made fun of him, the saint gave her sweets, asked her not to worry, and introduced herself as Emilione. This name also translates to a bird that flies in the blue sky. Then, the saint asked the little one to come to the sanctuary if she had problems, and she promised to let everyone there know. And when that little one appears, they will open the doors to her with joy. This helped Devil calm down completely, and she thanked the saint for always protecting them. After this, Emilione decided not to return to the carriage. She wanted to walk to the palace. Along the way, she addressed the people and wished them blessings. The saint believed that on this day, her sincerity would touch their souls. Shortly after, she was already in the palace, in a place of honor, next to Renaven and Jessie. Nobles approached one after another to greet the divine grace. Emilione had heard that the behavior of the aristocrats had changed, and now she confirmed it. But what surprised her most was that not everyone looked at her with contempt. Some admired the saint, second in rank only to the imperial family. The emperor now cared about the saint, as no one opposed the sanctuary thanks to her. Until now, many underestimated the sanctuary, but it possesses absolute power. Now, it is unlikely that anyone will dare to challenge them. The throne has belonged to the same family for generations, the imperial family Besseloil. But if the power that has been maintained for so long wavers, one will have to face whoever wants to cause harm. Emilione suddenly noticed that Lady Nestro was not in sight, although she doubted she would come up to greet them. Renaven became curious because the saint is looking for Ronla, but Emilione hinted that the high priest himself would be delighted to see her. The boy blushed instantly, and Jessie was surprised, as she had heard he liked that lady. Already somewhat affected, Renaven asked Jessie to refrain from such comments. For him, that whole story is already water under the bridge, and he doesn't want any more dealings with that girl. Emilione was not satisfied, and reminded him that he had been in love with Ronla, and his face tensed up. But then she thought his feelings couldn't have been that strong, which is why he got rid of it so easily. Before, it seemed to her that he truly loved her, but his face didn't reveal a hint of joy. Suddenly, the saint sensed an intoxicating aroma. She even asked Renaven and Jessie if they perceived a sweet smell. Only Emilione perceived the aroma, and that seemed very strange to her. Looking around, in a distant corner, she saw how a boy was being pushed into a box seat. That boy wanted to enter the hall, but a corpulent man, clearly an aristocrat, was preventing him. The saint became curious to know what was happening there, and went to investigate. Renaven followed her like her shadow, as an assistant and protector, but she asked him to go for the nights. Upon arriving at the place where everything was happening, the saint demanded they explain what was going on. There, in a small room on a divan, she saw a young man who, apparently, was trying to get close to her. The boy seemed frightened and bewildered, and at the same time, Emilione noticed his beauty. She even thought she didn't have a man in front of her, but a living work of art. Realizing she had been thinking about the boy, the saint ordered the knights to capture the man who was holding him back. Then she approached the stranger and asked if he was all right. On his jacket, crumpled to one side, she noticed the kingdom's crest. Emilione does not know which country he belongs to, but everything suggests that this young man is a prince. The boy apologized for the commotion he had caused. Assuring her that nothing serious had happened, the saint asked him to leave. And not worry, she even helped him get up, when suddenly she felt a slight dizziness. So as not to give herself away, she asked Renaven to take that man out of there. They covered his head with a handkerchief, so that no one would suspect he was the prince. And he followed the high priest. Then, that corpulent man, who wanted to get rid of the guest, knelt before the saint. Marquis Chevrolet apologized, saying he had gotten drunk and confused the opponent. But the saint did not approve of his actions. She had the impression that this guy wanted to do something similar to another person. Later she returned to the hall, where she met His Highness. He noticed her distressed appearance, and she told him that Marquis Chevrolet had caused a scene. And it was quite ugly, considering the guests who came to celebrate the goddess festival. And she asked Cassidra not to allow anything like that to happen that day. Emilione didn't care if the Marquis had just been confused. She wanted him to get what he deserved, and the prince ordered the knights to take Marquis Chevrolet to the underground prison. The fat man got scared and started begging for forgiveness, declaring it was just a small mistake. But the saint did not want to listen to his excuses, and they took him away, and Renee Ben returned to her. He left the guest in the corridor with a servant, and from there he could reach the carriage. Emilione felt a little sorry that he left so quickly, because she wanted to talk to him. And since it was so, she decided to interrogate the Marquis, and through Jessie she learned that he knew the boy's family. He was actually a prince from the kingdom of Essia. Emilione thought, I don't know why, that Marquis Chevrolet didn't attack the young man by chance. And she went down to the room where they had already locked up the villain in a cage, and he was still begging for mercy. He also swore it was an accident and promised it wouldn't happen again. Suddenly, Jessie remembered the rumors that the Marquis liked to play with children, not with adults. Upon hearing that the saint could uncover the terrible truth about him, the Marquis paled, and he trembled with fear. Then, Emilione discovered that the Marquis always took in children from commoner families, or orphans around 10 years old. The saint understood that this man did not have good intentions when taking the children, and she felt anger growing again. And she was curious because this guy wasn't on the lists. When Renaven investigated, he reported that nothing pointed to the Marquis's misdeeds. Everyone knew that he supported those children. It sounded like without Chevrolet, those children would have starved to death or died of some illness. Approaching the cell with the Marquis, the saint asked Renee Ben and Jessie to leave the room. After that, Chevrolet noticed how Emilione's face changed, and he became very scared, not knowing what she wanted from him. But she couldn't forgive that. Because of this guy, children suffered psychological trauma at that age. Because of him, they probably still blamed themselves for their powerlessness, and that's why they tolerated his antics. Knowing how things are now, Emilione was not going to forgive the villain and grabbed him by the neck, lifting him off the ground. He didn't understand why the saint cared about commoners. He himself considered them insignificant, but the girl only became more enraged and wanted to punish the scoundrel somehow. When suddenly the door was knocked on, and she threw the Marquis on the floor like a sack of potatoes before allowing the visitor to enter. It turned out to be the prince himself, now looking better, and he introduced himself as Eloi. The saint also introduced herself and asked him how he got there. The prince understood that the saint was having trouble because of him and declared that his kingdom would take care of the Marquis's sins. Therefore, he asked Emilione not to meddle, as they would take care of it themselves. It was unexpected for her. She thought Eloi hated conflicts, but he nodded. Expressing his gratitude, the prince once again asked the saint for permission to visit her sanctuary. This request was also unexpected, but the girl saw no reason why he couldn't come. After another thank you, Eloi promised to give notice in advance of his visits. And while he was in the room, the saint smelled that strange aroma again, although perhaps it was only her imagination. The girl grabbed the prince by the arm to ask him about it. He turned abruptly and looked at her in such a way that Emilione felt slightly dizzy again. And losing her balance, she fell to the floor, and since she was holding onto Lois, she dragged him down with her. The prince reacted immediately and began to apologize because the saint was in an uncomfortable situation because of him. He extended his hand to her, showing genuine concern, but the girl assured him she was fine, although something inside her wouldn't let her rest. Getting up, she explained that at the banquet she caught a sweet aroma, and it seemed to her that it came from the prince. His Highness blushed a little, as if he had been asked something inappropriate, and turning his face away with a guilty look, he explained that he had nothing to do with it. Realizing she had probably been mistaken, Emilione apologized and let the guest leave. In those moments, the prince looked like a shy fawn and managed to evade the answer. But Emilione was intrigued by what beast was hidden inside him and why he wore a mask. It was a difficult question for her, and she set a goal to unravel this enigma. Regarding the Marquis, she ordered his title revoked and him sent into exile. A despicable guy like him must pay. And the saint thought she hadn't punished him enough yet. Reneven and Jessie were to execute the order, and they were instructed to redirect the Marquis's men to the temple. Emilione understood that the kingdom of Essia would request the relevant authorizations, but she is determined to punish the Marquis for his vile acts. Jessie begged the saint to reconsider, as his Highness would hardly accept her decision. Emilione did not yield, especially since many aristocrats had already fallen because of her. And everything looks more like chaos. It is very likely that no one expects the Marquis's actions to come to light, and Emilione decided to disprove their expectations, so that everyone knows what a monster he is. The price Chevrolet must pay may seem high, but the saint saw no reason for clemency. Jessie understood that her convictions would not influence the decision. Later, the emperor called the saint, to whom it was unclear why he was angry about trivialities like commoners, especially now that there are many ambassadors in the palace, and he didn't want to undermine his authority with nonsense. That man is the most influential person in the empire, with the exception of the saint, and it infuriated him that influential people behaved that way and tried to turn a blind eye. In that situation, he believed it would be better if his power belonged to her. Emilione openly declared before all subjects to his majesty that he was wrong. The saint took advantage of the fact that, during the festival, she enjoyed the highest status, and now she had the audacity to suggest to the emperor that they use too, informal address. It was obvious that, after that, his majesty could not contain his anger and demanded respect, to which Emilione only advised him to work on his manners and not shout at her. She longed to see the ideal emperor before her. Before, she feared taking responsibility. That's why she took care of a small temple. Now she only needed one thing from the ruler. Since no one else brings up the topic, Emilione demanded the fulfillment of moral duty, because there is no aristocratic impunity in the law, and she wishes for a man who can understand her concern and cooperate to rule. The longer the conversation went on, the more evident it became that the saint was overstepping. But she didn't see it that way. She wasn't going to let crimes pass, because whoever forgives this to criminals and only cares about themselves, in the saint's opinion, is not fit to rule the state. And with that she turned around and left. The emperor was furious, almost purple with rage, but he knew there was truth in her words, and he couldn't do anything to the saint, while Emilione now felt great. Upon exiting onto the street, she ran into René Ben, who looked very worried. Jess was not with him, but the saint decided to give her time to recover. Emilione understood that she had done something a saint should not do. She confronted the very son of the empire, but she is not a real saint. They only gave her divine power, and she wants to help those at the very bottom. She was going to help them get up, because that is precisely the mission of a saint. Now she is getting ready to return to the sanctuary, and asks René Ben not to rush and come with the others. The high priest watched her walk away for a while, recalling each of her words. It was precisely because of all those actions that he loved Lady Emilione. That night she went to bed early, and the next morning, as if the fatigue had vanished. During the holy festival, she had to spend a lot of time in the palace, but she decided to stay in the temple. Moreover, René Ben manages wonderfully with his assignments, even without her. Now the girl can calmly take care of her business and headed to her favorite place, the library. There she took out the Imperial Code of Laws, and boy, was this book quite heavy. A large part of this book is dedicated to aristocrats who exploit the common people. Emilione wanted to ensure that none of them could manipulate the people at will. Never again. For this, all clauses of the code must be supplemented with appropriate points. Aware that this would take a long time, the saint decided to go to her bedroom and start reading there. The room was on the second floor, and there were quite a few steps to climb. While climbing them, Emilione accidentally tripped and realized she was about to kiss the steps. Furthermore, the book was dragging her down even faster. The girl didn't even have time to pray before landing, when she felt someone catch her just in time. She expected to see René Ben, who usually was nearby, although he should be in the palace now. But when she looked up, Emilione saw Prince Eloi. Out of surprise, she even dropped the book, and it echoed loudly down the stairs. His Highness was glad the saint recognized him, while she was intrigued what he was doing there. That he is alone and without servants is strange, even more so that he appeared like a ghost just in time. Despite everything, she didn't forget to thank him for his help, but suddenly she felt that strange dizziness again, just like the previous time. Still, the reason for his appearance lingered in her head, so she decided to carefully coax it out of him. Eloi explained that he came alone, because he is not well liked by the royal family. Then he quickly apologized, saying he wanted to keep his visit to the temple secret from his father. He spoke convincingly, but the saint suspected he was hiding something, so she decided to play along and try to find out what he was plotting. After assuring him she wouldn't betray him, she asked why he was without servants, and the prince, with an innocent voice, explained that they were accompanying him, but he accidentally separated from them. Pretending to believe him, Emilione tried to coax the truth out of him at the same time. But then her gaze fell on a bare foot, and she understood that she had lost her slipper when she almost fell. Then she remembered that she was in a nightgown and robe, besides being unwashed and with a disastrous hairstyle. The girl became extremely embarrassed and wanted to disappear from there as soon as possible. As soon as she sped up, Ulwa stopped her, and she turned, thinking it might be something important. For him, it was truly very important to return the slipper she had lost. The prince managed to pick it up and now helped the saint put it on her foot. This scene is somewhat reminiscent of the Cinderella story. Our heroine probably also read one like that in her past life. It's just that now the prince didn't offer her his hand and heart, but instead gave her a thick book that also fell. For an instant, Emilione regretted not being in a fairy tale, but she finds it more interesting to unmask villains. She thanked Ulwa for the help and allowed him to take the book to her room. Again, the girl reviewed her actions and understood that the prince was trying to seduce her. It is also clear to her that, in reality, he is not in love with her, he is just pretending, and she felt an almost irritating curiosity to know what that guy wanted from her. The answer didn't take long to arrive. Upon arrival, Ulwa confessed that he needed the saint's help. Aware that the conversation would be serious, Emilione invited the prince to the study. There he timidly admitted that he was a little embarrassed to ask for her help, as they barely knew each other. The saint reminded him that she helped everyone and asked why he had made such a long journey, also asking him to set aside all his worries. His Highness at that moment looked at her as if she had fallen into his trap. But the girl didn't forget for a second that it was a game, and tried to play along in the most believable way. A spark flashed in the prince's eyes, but he continued feigning sincerity, and confessed that they were planning to revive slavery in his kingdom. Emilia feigned surprise. She knew the previous saint abolished slavery there, but since she is no longer there, that king is striving to reverse everything. The girl understood that outside the empire total chaos reigned, and the prince continued to show how good he was, and that he was against slavery. At that moment, his words sounded so convincing that one couldn't tell if he was telling the truth or lying. Ulwa, the fourth prince, whose older brother is the heir, shares his father's opinion, and he was worried that if slavery returned to his country, other countries would be encouraged too. At the same time, Ulwa hoped that he and the saint were on the same wavelength, and with a sincere voice again, he begged Emilione to help him. The saint knew very well that her position, as it was, did not belong to any state. Therefore, she had no need to worry only about the empire. She could help in other lands. Besides, Emilione knew that the interest in slavery had not disappeared, but now they wanted to revive it. The prince, at that moment, said how ashamed he was of being unable to do anything about it. Being a prince, looking at him, the girl doubted that his strength was insufficient, and that also indicated he was plotting something. Playing along, Emilione agreed to help his highness. Ulwa, after that, was genuinely happy, and the saint reminded him that they were on the same wavelength. But in reality, she accepted to find out what such a complicated opponent was plotting. For that, she needed to let this young man get as close to her as possible. Shortly after the prince left, Emilione prepared to meet another person, someone who is absolutely necessary in her future plans, and she headed towards Jessie. After knocking and announcing she was entering, Emilione opened the old and creaky door. The room was dark and silent, and she saw Jessie huddled on the bed. The girl was crying silently, and she got a little scared by the saint's sudden appearance. Emilione realized that she had spoken too harshly to her earlier when giving the order about the marquis. Approaching and hugging her, the saint begged Jessie to cry no more. She admitted that she hadn't been entirely right either, and also decided to confess why she had been so angry. Jessie believed it was because, for a saint, commoners mattered more than aristocrats, and she understood perfectly, so Emilione congratulated her. Now Fodder understood that the saint's anger was not a mistake, and she reproached herself for having doubted. She understood, after she was ordered to bring the children, that the marquis kept locked up. And when Jessie saw them, she understood more than clearly the reason for Lady Emilione's fury. Now she felt very ashamed before the saint, and admitted that she had been hasty in judging her. Then, Emilione became curious to know how this girl would act if the saint's path turned out to be wrong. But she, eternally grateful to be alive thanks to the saint, swore to support any decision of hers. Emilione shook her head, as they hadn't understood her correctly, and explained to Jessie that, if she ever noticed she was doing something wrong, she should convince her otherwise. And it wouldn't be an order, but a request, where Emilione tenderly stroked her protégé. And she accepted. On the third day of the festival, a letter arrived from the county of Nestro to the sanctuary. and along with it appeared its author, Countess Ronla, explaining that her arrival with the letter was a coincidence. From her mood, it was clear that she felt much better than at the home tournament. Ronla decided to visit the saint, as rumors reached her about what happened on the first day of the festival. Emilione assured her she was fine, but appreciated the concern. Afterwards, the Duchess asked to be called whenever they wanted, and she would gladly keep them company for a chat. Furthermore, she timidly declared that she did not wish to take the saint away from others. But it was not a problem for her. On the contrary, she was happy to be near Ronla. The Duchess herself, during the last reception, understood that the saint would not let anyone get close. And now that she is here, she can consider herself a bit special. That request was quite bold, but Emilione could not answer immediately. She then left the guest, explaining that she needed to be away for a moment. The young woman needed to sort out her thoughts and felt that this situation had already happened. Recalling all the moments she had spent with Ronla up to this day, Emilione concluded that this lady is trying to gain power over her, acting very cunningly. Before, she thought that, like other aristocrats, this caused the Duchess antipathy. Now the situation is even more confusing, so it is necessary to think carefully about every possible step. The saint did not return, and Ronla began to get nervous. She even pushed a large vase, as if that would help the waiting time pass faster. Emilione noted her action just as she was returning, but decided to hide and see what happened. She heard Ronla murmuring that she did not like the reaction of either the prince or the saint. She always felt uncomfortable in this place, and taking a fragment, she picked it up. Then she used magic, and the broken vase was whole again, as if it had never fallen. Emilione was slightly surprised to learn that Lady Nestro was a mage, although it was likely, since her brother is one too. Now she was curious to know why the young Duchess hid this gift. Meanwhile, Ronla began to talk, wishing for Emilione to return soon. And it made the saint uncomfortable that this person uttered her name. Deciding she had waited long enough, she approached the guest, who had sat back down on the sofa, and upon seeing Emilione, she immediately showed incredible joy on her face, saying that, while waiting, she admired the local garden a little, and was not bored at all. This garden was the pride of the temple, and the previous saint worked very hard on it. Their conversation was interrupted by Jessie, who announced with some fear the arrival of the crown prince. Cassandra entered accompanied by several knights and servants, and noticed that the ladies were having tea. Ronla, upon seeing him, wanted to flirt, but the saint interrupted her by asking why he had come. His explanation was vague, saying he couldn't find her at the festival. But the saint didn't want to waste much time with this guest, and asked him again to explain the reason for his visit. Moreover, he arrived without notice, but he was worried the saint would refuse if he sent a letter. He now has an important conversation, and Emilia ordered that tea be prepared for him too. Ronla advised him to drink Esval tea, which is healing and only found in the temple. But the prince became curious to know what the saint was drinking. Upon learning that she preferred simple herbal tea, His Highness ordered that he be served the same. Emilione tried to dissuade him, knowing that he might not like the taste. But Cassandra insisted. Shortly after, they served him a cup with a greenish liquid. Immediately after, His Highness brought up the day the saint argued with his father. The young woman understood how it might look from the outside, but assured the prince that they only had differences of opinion. Still, Cassandra begged her to apologize to the emperor, as he did not want to harm him. He simply lacks empathy, as he carries the responsibility of a huge state. Therefore, His Highness wishes for the saint to reconcile with his father. Emilione even laughed and asked the prince to leave, if he had only come for that. To her surprise, he agreed. As if he wouldn't convince her of anything, Ronla suddenly noticed that her tea had a strange smell, and insinuated that he better not drink it. Upon smelling it, Cassandra also noticed an unusual aroma, but the saint warned him that it was not to his taste, and immediately offered him those blessed candies, adding that they tasted the same as the tea. Moreover, they improve concentration and clear the mind. Emilione held the jar almost to his nose, and he examined her suspiciously. It seemed strange to him that the saint liked that, and she admitted that she wasn't the only one who loved it. Still, Cassandra refused to try it himself and passed the jar to his servant. He wanted to give it to the princess, thinking she would like it. The saint was a little stunned, not fully understanding the prince's actions. Suddenly, the jar that was in the jewelry box fell, and the servants trembled at what awaited them. The prince's face contorted in anger, threatening the servant with a good whipping. The servants fell to their knees, begging for mercy and asking him not to get angry. Cassandra, furious, ordered the knights to take those inept subjects away. Instantly, they were grabbed and taken away, but they kept begging for forgiveness. The saint did not like the situation and asked His Highness to withdraw the knights. The prince assured her that he would not tarnish the temple's reputation and would punish the culprits in the palace. Emilione did not want anyone to suffer for a simple jar. It didn't seem fair to her, but Cassandra wouldn't give in, arguing that they had broken his possession, and they must pay for it. It seemed that the prince equated the broken jar with the crimes of the nobility. In the meeting, he showed he knew how to yield, so the saint had a better opinion of him than of the emperor. But he seems to have his internal demons, and Emilia decided to play along. She declared that she was now disappointed in him, as she had asked him to withdraw the knights, and added that, although he is the crown prince, he is not allowed to go against her will. His Highness stood up to reply, but the young duchess immediately intervened, and with a trembling voice, begged them not to argue. It hurt her a lot to see that, and her heart already suffered from the breaking of the saint's gift. Then she added that, since it was already the prince's possession, it was up to him to decide the fate of the servants. It sounded smart, but cruel. Emilia did not expect something like that, and feeling pride, His Highness nodded, saying that Lady Nestor was right and that the saint should not interfere. She couldn't help it. Her gift was at stake. Then he asked for the names of the servants. One is named Tesh Ashap and the other, Florin Rilta. They answered in a low and trembling voice, fearing that the saint would become even angrier. Afterwards she learned that Tesh had a father, an aunt, and 3 nephews. His father was sick and his aunt couldn't walk, so he was raising his nephews alone. Emilione understood that not all of the prince's servants were rich aristocrats. Florin had a father, mother, and a younger sister. His father worked as a head servant, and his sister was planning to get married. After this, the saint hoped that the stories of these servants would give the prince certain ideas. However, he didn't catch the hint, and she reminded him of her conversation with the emperor. Then he declared that there was no need to punish the servants, as he could give them candies whenever he wanted. But if he finishes someone off, there will be no turning back. Cassandra was somewhat stunned. If he wasn't even thinking of killing them, just teaching them a lesson with the whip. But not even that solution convinced the saint. And for the last time, she begged for clemency, adding that even after physical or moral punishment, one can lose a person. And the saint wants to see on the throne someone who knows moral principles. Cassandra is the future emperor, and she hopes he has understood the necessary foundations for a leader. To conclude, Emilione asked him to reflect on what makes a ruler. A ruler, the prince answered her like a student in class, that a ruler must always demonstrate his greatness. But then he returned to his essence, muttering that the subjects also need a firm hand. Listening to him, one understands that the strength of a ruler is manifested in the oppression of the weak. But after this, it is difficult to know how many will follow His Highness. Not only he has a family, common people do too. The prince must be kinder. Cassandra wanted to reply to the saint, but her severe and furious gaze silenced him. He only cursed, understanding that Emilione was right and headed for the exit. The duchess immediately followed him, with the secret hope of consoling him, and finally apologized to the saint, promising to send her news later. The guilty servants were still in the temple. They wanted to thank her in person, and bowing deeply, they expressed their respect. After this, Emilione asked them to inform the temple if the situation worsened. Then the saint spoke with Jesse about Eloi, the 4th prince of Essex. His mother was from the Ischa clan, so this prince has few chances for the throne. Ischa is a tribe of thieves who wander through the western part of the kingdom. But Jesse also discovered that Duchess Nestro is the younger sister of King Esse. In that case, it turns out that Eloi is Ronla and Varan's cousin. Some time later, this prince visited the saint again, and she gave him her blessing. Eloi took her hand carefully and kissed its back for the warm welcome, and without letting go of her hand, he hesitated a bit to remind her of his request. She promised to help him prevent slavery, and now he came to discuss the details. Furthermore, he promised to pay a fair price, knowing that the saint was the best for this. By payment, he meant money, exquisite delicacies, and all kinds of jewels. But these gifts were not very valuable to the saint. Suddenly, Alois stopped, looked at Emilione mysteriously, and smiled sweetly. Then he knelt before her and begged her to help him become king. This was unexpected. A short while ago, she and Jesse were arguing that he had almost no chance. The prince himself understood that he was far inferior to the other aspirants to the throne. That's why he needed the saint's help, and they both knew now that only she could help him without tarnishing her position. When they act together, it will be much easier for him to create the state he desires. This encouraged Elwa, and he is willing to give the saint anything, even the kingdom. Then, bowing and in a soft voice, His Highness begged her to allow him to serve the saint. Emilione understood well that if a kingdom passed into her power, it would become the property of the temple, and then a sacred kingdom will be born. The prince's proposal was tempting, but they didn't know each other well enough to solve such serious problems together. Emilia asked the prince for time, and he didn't insist at all. In the end, Elwa left with his hands completely empty. The saint took care of her business, and the next day opened an orphanage in the temple. The children crowded at the entrance, happy for their future new home. Renaven, in charge of settling them, asked them to enter one by one. But they were children. They promised to obey and then ran, almost knocking over the high priest. The little ones were delighted. The place was clean and spacious, with a bed for each one. The dining room was so huge that everyone fit together, and there was still space left. Emilione watched everything from afar, and she loved that the children liked it. Just as she imagined the little ones living in their new home, Prince Elwa appeared again. He confessed that he was interested in the orphanage and asked permission to take a look. The saint did not object, although she was worried that the children would not show the due respect to His Highness. But he understood that they were little ones, and he didn't boast about his position either, so Emilione invited him to explore. While she notified the others of the important visit, she didn't expect to see him today, but it was an opportunity to get to know him better. On the way through the garden, she saw how the girl devil approached some bushes and oops. She tore the sleeve of her dress on the thorns. She had also made a wound and feared the saint would scold her, but she calmly healed her scratch, hoping that the little one would like her new home. Now she will live with other children, and Devel is very grateful for it. The saint promised her that she would always be welcome until she grew up and made her life. This means the little one won't have to wander the streets looking for crumbs anymore. She will always be fed and sleep under a roof in a cozy bed. The girl was very happy. She loved the place, but she liked the saint even more. Afterwards, Devel ran towards the other children. Emilione only asked her to be careful not to fall. In just a couple of hours, almost all the children had adapted well. But then a rustle was heard in the bushes, and Emilione went to see what it was. Among the leaves she saw Chen, and it seemed the girl was hiding from someone. Emilione asked her not to sit in the bushes so as not to hurt herself, and besides, insects might bite her. The girl was not in a hurry, as she didn't want anyone to find her. Noticing that the little one was scared, the saint begged her to tell what happened. She confessed that Roy and Cheryl had been arguing a lot lately, and she didn't know whose side to take. That's why she had hidden, to spend some time alone. But the girl flinched when she heard the voices of those two children nearby. Leaning over her, they looked somewhat distressed, as they had looked for her everywhere. But they immediately straightened up and greeted the saint so as not to be rude. After the greeting, the children invited Chen to play with them and started arguing among themselves. Cheryl thought Roy always proposed nonsense and demanded he get out of there. It seemed sparks flew between them, and Chen got even more scared. Emilione understood that each of those children wanted to play with Chen, but in their own way. Now she understood why the little one was sad. It's no wonder with two arguing all the time. The children demanded that Chen choose immediately who she was going to play with. At that moment, she was even more afraid to see their faces distorted by mutual discontent. The girl was completely confused. She didn't want to offend either of them. The other would be unsatisfied. And while the little ones were busy, the saint began to think about how to reconcile them. Suddenly, a familiar voice resounded behind, and turning around, she saw His Highness Elwa again. And then she had an idea: to pass on the task of figuring out how to reconcile the three children to the prince. She briefly told Elwa about the situation, while Chen hid behind her back. And the prince began to think about how to give the right direction to these little devils. He thought of something and asked the saint for permission to speak to the children alone. Emilione did not object, hoping he would manage to establish a connection between them. Afterwards, with quite a voice, he asked the little ones to be quiet and pay attention to him. Out of nowhere, he took out a bud and explained that it was a flower that hadn't bloomed yet. And while Cheryl's and Roy's attention focused on that bud, he proposed that they play as they wished with Chen. Then he started doing a trick and covered the bud with a silk scarf, saying at the same time that both children, Chen should play with only one of them. And when he removed the scarf, the children saw that the flower had withered and half of its petals had fallen off. Awa explained that the flower dislikes fighting, and when its opinion is not taken into account, and that it wants to play with everyone together and not separately. The prince begged the children to do what the flower asked and play without fighting. Ulwa covered the flower again with the cloth, saying that someone accepted to play together. And when he pulled the cloth away, the children saw a beautiful bouquet in front of them. Cheryl and Roy were delighted, rather because the flower withered and then turned into a rose. His Highness introduced himself to the children and explained that Chen's feelings were like those flowers. No matter how much they like her, if they don't listen to her, she will feel very hurt. But Cheryl protested. Chen hadn't told them that something displeased her. He remembered that they lost sight of her, and now they noticed that she was hiding behind the saint. This shows the little one that what happens repels her, and speaks louder than 1,000 words. Then, the prince asked them to remember what he did for the flower to open. The children shouted in unison that they had listened to him and obeyed. Then, people should also be treated that way, listening to the one you like to understand them. This is also called respect, and His Highness asked the children to remember it. They must apologize to Chen for not being able to share her, and pull her like a piece of cheese. Understanding this, the little ones approached the girl, apologized, and promised not to fight anymore. This reassured Chen, and she smiled sweetly at him. The saint was also happy, as not every prince gets along so easily with commoner children. At that moment, Prince Ulwa grew a lot in her eyes. Soon the last day of the festival arrived, and Emilione was discussing some matters with Renee Ben. The saint took out an envelope and boasted that she would receive something valuable from the Duchy of Naster. The high priest was slightly disturbed. He believed that accepting sudden offers was dangerous. At the same time, he understood that Prince Ulwa was only seeking the throne, using the temple's support. However, that did not contradict his interests. Miliona confessed to her assistant that she had plotted something very interesting and threatening. The high priest was shocked by such a frank confession. The girl understood that it would be very sudden for him, confirmed by his wide eyes. Then she confessed that she needed something from the person who tried to get close to her using Jessie. Instantly recalling the lamp incident, Renee Ben understood that the saint was referring to the anti-divine cult. The girl still doesn't know who the real culprit is, but she has some suspicions. Simply put, the situation did not yet allow for capturing the wretch who attempted against the saint. Besides, there was no evidence, and they also had to protect the temple's image. Renaven suddenly expressed his concern that the saint wasn't taking care of herself at all. She throws herself into fire and water for others, but doesn't think about herself. But Emilione did not fear for her life, as she knows she will not die and her body recovers quickly. And stroking the worried assistant's head, she asked him not to be so distressed. Renee Bentz calmed down a bit, but still asked his lady to be more cautious. They arrived at the duchy, and Emilione instantly noticed looks of disapproval upon her. But the hostess who had invited her was nowhere in sight for some reason. Renee Bentz explained that everyone was acting cautiously due to the saint's conflict with the emperor. Then they went to the main hall, where Ronla received them in a luxurious dress and an excellent mood. She was worried about the saint because of the recent incident, but she was happy to see her in perfect condition. Then she paid attention to Renee Ben and, as a mere formality, greeted him too, immediately apologizing because her reception might seem less than ideal. How did Renee Ben get enraged? It was true, Ronla hadn't even gone out to receive the saint. Emilione also heard him clearly, and couldn't believe he dared to say that to the girl he loved. The high priest's comment disconcerted the Duchess, but she understood her mistake, and Emilione decided to calm the atmosphere, telling the hostess of the event that they hadn't had lunch yet. Ronla's mood improved instantly, as if a button had been pressed, and she invited them to follow her. This time she organized a modest reception, as she didn't believe the saint would actually come. Suddenly, an agitated maid ran towards them and addressed Lady Nestra. Emilione knew something had happened, and she also sensed a certain aroma. Then Ronla, very agitated, explained that her cousin was in the dining room and they had just informed her. Sensing that eating with the prince would be uncomfortable for the saint, she decided to ask him to leave. But Emilione objected, and now she understood why that sweet aroma was present. She didn't expect to see Aloys there, but she didn't think it was impossible either. Ronla was even more surprised when she realized that both knew each other and had spoken recently. She became curious to know what they talked about, and prepared to listen as if it were the juiciest gossip. Ulwa started by saying that the saint had helped him a lot when the Marquis framed him. Lady Nestro's reaction indicated she knew nothing about it. She was intrigued, but His Highness decided to keep the details secret, which annoyed her. But Ulwa begged his cousin not to try to find out anything and to attend to the saint. Since she was the most important guest, the Duchess led the guests to the table and then asked if they had liked the delicacies. Emilione courteously praised the food, saying everything was exquisite as always. Ronla was also intrigued to know how Renaven and her cousin had rated the dishes. Ulwa loved it, but the meat seemed very tough to the priest, and the smell struck him as strange. Lady Nestro was in total shock. This man had never spoken to her like that before. Nevertheless, she promised to order something else to be prepared, but Renaven refused, as the saint likes everything. Emilione noticed that he behaved like this only towards Ronla. For some reason, he had suddenly changed his attitude towards her, and suddenly she thought of adding fuel to the fire, and she spilled a glass of wine. Emilione poured the drink over herself, pretending it was an accident. All the men instantly poured their concern onto her, and it was just a stained dress. The saint didn't expect such an exaggerated reaction, but to tell the truth, she even liked it. The Duchess sat there, mouth agape, as if she didn't understand what the hell had happened. Meanwhile, Ulwa ran around the table and put his cloak on the saint. Hoping she hadn't been scared, the girl thanked him, and Ben looked on jealously. It was supposed to be his job to take care of the saint. Still, he commented that the prince's cloak might be too heavy for Lady Alien. Ignoring him, the prince asked the saint to wait a moment, while he ordered a new outfit to be prepared for her. This confirmed to the girl that the prince really wanted to win her favor. After all, he communicates kindly with the children and takes care of the saint to achieve it. But Emilione even liked that impudence, and when the prince approached the maid to give instructions about the clean dress, Emilione confessed to the high priest that she was going to accept the prince's proposal. She didn't tell him the reason, but asked him to trust her, and Ben had no choice but to agree. After a while, the saint received a new outfit, and now she looked very much like a noble aristocrat. It was beautiful, and the Duchess immediately showered Emilione with compliments. She also heard praise for her appearance from His Highness, Ulwa, after which he asked the saint for permission to accompany her. Emilione playfully accepted and held out her hand to him, and to convince him, she smiled sweetly. And Ronla clung to Renaven to keep her company, as the last time he promised to accompany her. So he had to refuse due to circumstances, but now it seems he decided to take revenge. To the Duchess, that sounded like being abandoned at her own wedding. On the verge of tears from the offense, she begged him to at least tell her the reason for the refusal. The high priest maintained a face as cold as ice. Emilione would want to help him somehow in this situation, but now she is busy with Ulwa. She only hoped that he would catch her mental request to accept Lady Nestro's proposal. Did it work? The boy in the robe agreed to dance with the young Duchess. Emilione really couldn't imagine what that might end up being for him, but she hoped everything would turn out well, and she returned her attention to Prince Aloys. Soon they entered the main hall, where their arrival was solemnly announced. Many of the guests immediately paid attention to them, some calmly, and others with displeasure. The saint only wished everyone the goddess's blessing, ignoring the sour faces. After the greeting, she thanked His Highness for keeping her company, but he himself was delighted to spend time with such a beautiful lady, and besides a saint. And when he kissed her hand, a murmur of surprise ran through the hall. Some supposed that love had blossomed between them, and those murmurs reached Emilione. But everyone fell silent when His Highness Cassidra was announced. His face looked displeased, and judging by the aristocrats' questions, they didn't expect him at this event. The prince probably came looking for Ronla, and feeling his bad mood, the saint decided to avoid him. She even turned away so he wouldn't see her, when suddenly she heard his voice behind her. Forcing a smile, Emilione greeted him courteously and asked what brought him here. His Highness doesn't need an excuse to appear at the Nestro Duchy, and that insistence on asking only enraged him further. Then, Cassidra saw Prince Alios and restrained himself from being rude, but blurted out that the Emperor planned to reinstate Marquis Cheverly. He wanted to provoke Ulwa, but he angered the saint, annoyed that he brought up the topic. Surprise! She didn't know about it, being only a person living in the temple. Cassidra contradicted him, because she devoted herself to the state and is a citizen. It does not justify her ignorance, and the Empire would not dismiss the Marquis over nonsense. But there was a problem. To revoke the punishment, her permission was needed. Cassandra wanted to mock Emilione and Aloys by talking about this in front of everyone. Faced with this, the saint threatened to leave the Bessaloyal Empire. This way, the prince would not suffer so much. Such a declaration visibly impacted His Highness. Even the color drained from his face. And he declared that saints had never abandoned Bessaloyal, nor had they intermarried with the royal family. The girl just smiled mockingly. And behind them, they started whispering that she was leaving and no one would fight the monsters anymore. Prince Cassandra also understood the regrettable consequences of the saint's departure, and he thought Aloy had something to do with it, which further fueled his anger, and the prince could barely restrain himself from beating him right there. Noticing he was about to explode, the saint asked the prince to calm down. However, his emotions overwhelmed him so much that he yelled at Emilione to shut up herself. We can only imagine what would have happened next, but their argument was interrupted by a loud crash outside. Someone among the guests shouted that it was a monster attack. Behind the windows, dark silhouettes with bright, menacing red eyes appeared. In such a short time, this is the third time they have appeared, as if someone were orchestrating it. Renaven supposed this was the work of the anti-divine cult, and the saint yelled at the terrified Duchess to evacuate everyone immediately. Again, there was no oracle before the monster attack, and, judging by the fact that this is the third time they have appeared in front of the saint, they are after her. Panic seized the people, begging the saint for help because they didn't want to die. And a man begged her to destroy the monsters, as she did in the temple. But even if she wanted to, she couldn't repeat it now. Hearing her refusal, the people groaned even more, that they were going to die now, and they were so young. In reality, Emilione didn't want to use divine punishment, as it is very powerful, and she still hasn't managed to control it well. From a distant corner, a girl leaned over her mother's body, begging her to wake up. The saint entrusted Renaven to help that woman. She was trying to control herself, as destroying monsters is her duty. They still have time to prepare, as the creatures haven't reached them yet. On the paralyzed Prince Aloy, she saw a dagger and decided to borrow it. He lacks what it takes to be a knight, but that little devil knows things and is self-confident. Seeing her intentions, the high priest shrieked as if he were the one being sent to the monsters. Emilione asked him not to scream. Someone must deal with the beasts. Suddenly, Prince Aloy expressed his desire to go to the front. The saint was slightly surprised by this, as he looked thin and with hands that doubtfully held a sword often. He just had that build. He is actually a knight, and trusts that he can handle the monsters. Emilia didn't argue with him anymore, but begged him to return alive. Then she approached Prince Cassandra and asked to borrow his sword, which sounded a bit bold. She even asked the crown prince to stay where he was. Cassandra, like a small child, was a little disconcerted, but accepted the evacuation. And then the saint approached him, asking him to hurry up if he wasn't going to help. He promised to stay in the rear guard, and asked Aloy to finish off the creatures as quickly as possible. It was the perfect moment to taunt the emperor's son for being a coward. But Emilia didn't do it. Only after looking around did she praise Aloy, the only one who dared to challenge the monsters. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass, and the first monster was already entering through the window. Renaven was ordered to create a sacred barrier to repel the beast's blows. At that very moment, several monsters burst into the room, resembling mutant red-haired apes. Their menacing roar made people scatter to every corner. But Emilione was ready to fight the intruders and started calling them. Attracting their attention, the monsters turned their wrinkled, hairy faces towards the saint. The girl was only glad that their gazes were fixed only on her. This way people could evacuate peacefully. And without waiting for them to attack first, Emilione lunged towards them with a small dagger. Fencing lessons helped her even with that blade, and time and again she cut the hairy hides. The creatures howled in pain, trying to surround the man attacking them. But the saint invoked Renaven's help, and he, appearing instantly in the perfect position, wounded the monster's leg. Green blood splashed everywhere, but Emilione was glad that they were almost finished. That monster was still alive and hovered with its body over the Duchess. Noticing this, the saint got scared and promised that if she survived, she would give him a good reprimand, since she had been ordered to move people away and get out of there, and now she was huddled, and with her eyes closed in fear. Ronla prepared to say goodbye to life, but when she opened her eyes, she saw that the monster was no longer above her. But the saint, Emilione managed to push the monster away before it could destroy the Duchess's body. However, it recovered quickly and prepared to destroy whoever prevented it from dining. Reacting instantly, Emilione dodged and stabbed the dagger into its rear, although she didn't aim on purpose. But pulling the weapon back required effort, as if it were stuck, and the saint twisted the dagger several times. Rage also helped her. That monster had gotten too close to the Duchess, and now its groan of pain resonated not only in the hall, but throughout the mansion, as the monster spewed black smoke. With the last push, the beast breathed its last, and the saint hoped everything was over. But Prince Eloi called her and shouted that there was still one monster left. The girl could barely curse mentally when a mutant monkey tried to crush her with its huge fists. Emilione could barely jump aside, and a new fanatic was already running to her aid. Just as he stabbed the sword into the monster, Eloi gave her the signal to act, and the saint grabbed the hide with her hands and began to use her divine power to end its essence. Like the previous one, the monster shrieked with all its might, and black smoke poured out of its eyes. And Mouse, this beast died the same way, and in the end turned into a huge black drop, from which a hairy tail soon emerged. And reddish, just not of such a large size. The black bubble burst, and Emilia saw ordinary monkeys, and while she tried to understand what was happening, 2 little monkeys jumped into her arms. Eloi was a little surprised to see these little creatures. Then the saint explained that they were baby monkeys, and that was their original form. His Highness noticed that Emilia had injured herself fighting the monsters. The wound looked very deep, and he advised her to heal it as soon as possible. Immediately, from the other side, René Ben approached, who began to beg the saint to listen to the prince. And furthermore, he explained that it is better to kill the little monkeys right away, because they could turn into monsters again. Emilione didn't like the idea at all, and the little animals got scared, as if they understood every word. The girl understood that René Ben was right, but seeing those little faces, she couldn't send them to their deaths. And in reality, she felt it would be fairer to kill the one who used these beauties so cruelly. Now they are just little monkeys that also need affection. Emilione handed them over to the high priest and suggested returning to the temple. She didn't realize she stepped in a puddle of green blood and slipped. Luckily, she didn't fall, as Prince Eloi arrived in time again to help her, who also promised to pretend he hadn't heard her little outburst. After that, he insisted on continuing to carry her in his arms, even if it was to the temple door, ignoring the saint's protests. And Renéven's face swelled up again, because he has to carry monkeys, and a stranger took the saint away. Suddenly, Cassidra appeared in their path. He came out of hiding and demanded to speak to Emilione, but the saint needed peace. Besides, she had nothing more to say to the crown prince. She just returned his sword and mumbled her thanks. In short, His Highness was snubbed again by these people, who headed straight for the exit. Ronla saw everything. She was just beginning to recover from the shock. The next morning, Emilione woke up feeling full of energy and vitality. Immediately, she decided to check the wound, as she felt no discomfort, and noticed that not even a scar remained on the skin. She didn't know she could recover so quickly. Then, she remembered the little monkeys and decided to go see how they were. As soon as she opened the door, whoosh, she bumped into Prince Eloi, as if he were waiting for that precise moment. Seeing her so full of energy, he was glad the saint was well. Phew, what a relief that he was there so early. It explained why Emilione, half asleep, had assigned him a room. The girl confessed that her wound had healed and asked if anything had happened during the night. The prince assured that nothing serious, only that someone had spread rumors about them. What a scandal. It seems people didn't fully understand their relationship and drew their own conclusions. What an imagination. They probably saw them when the prince was carrying the saint in his arms. That explains everything. Suddenly, René Ben appeared running, with a face of terror, as if he had seen a ghost. And he begged for help. Emilione had never seen him like that, and felt a lurch in her heart. The high priest couldn't speak clearly, and indicated for her to follow him to the garden. Something serious must have happened. Everything was destroyed, as if a horde of bandits had passed through. The priests also lay like corpses, and the saint asked what had happened. Renéven was stunned, his face reflecting horror and indignation, but he remained silent. And only when Emilione shouted louder did he remember the warning that bringing animals was dangerous. The girl understood that all this disaster had been caused by the little monkeys, who then appeared with satisfied faces, as if they had done something very important. But they are little monkeys, and they want to play. And upon seeing the saint, they immediately jumped into her arms. Due to the confusion, the high priest began to scold them for hugging the lady without permission. But she herself addressed the pets to confess whether they were guilty of the destruction. Her expression was severe, and the animals felt guilt. But she couldn't stay angry for long and apologized to Renevin, which only outraged him. Knowing he wouldn't convince the saint, he only asked her to be careful. She should be cleaning, but Emilione understood that the priests were exhausted, and she sent them to rest. Thinking what to do with the little monkeys, she heard Alwai's voice, who immediately grabbed one, asking them to take him, but so abruptly that the animal got scared. The monkey let go and jumped back towards the saint. The girl worried about her pets, but the prince asked her to reconsider her attitude towards them. After all, they were monsters a short time ago, and having them close is not the best idea. Emilione agreed with His Highness, but only partially. She didn't see much danger in the monkeys, but understood that their antics could interfere with the temple's work. These little ones need constant supervision, and the saint is ready to take care of it herself. She let them romp, especially since there was almost nothing left to break in the garden. And she dedicated the remaining time to the prince, who wanted to talk to her. While having tea, Alwa declared that he is one of those who would sacrifice one life to save two, and nothing would stop him in such a situation. But he is curious to know what the saint would do in that case, and Emilione became thoughtful. Then she proudly admitted that, most likely, she would sacrifice herself to save three. Furthermore, everything could change if someone truly special appeared in her life. The value of that person should be comparable to tens, even hundreds of lives. And His Highness immediately asked whom Emilione would choose as that person, admitting that, in her place, he would probably have sacrificed that special person. His Highness is sure that person will understand his choice. After talking with Alwa, the saint went to bed, and Renevin was reporting how many letters they had received. They started sending them from everywhere after Emilione, in front of the prince, and the aristocrats declared that she was leaving the empire. The saint ordered those letters to be burned. It is obvious that society fears facing the monsters without her. Obeying, the high priest began to throw the envelopes into the fire, and in the process noticed a letter from the palace. Sent by Yun Pervain, all the emperor's children carry that surname, except for the crown prince. However, Emilione was hearing that name for the first time. She didn't think His Majesty had more descendants. Curiosity invaded her, and she decided to read that letter. Then she started muttering that if that were true, she wouldn't forgive him, disconcerting Renevin. Promising to tell him later, the saint asked for Jessie to be called as they were leaving for the palace. That golden letter had a spell that only the reigning family could use. Only the senders could remove it, but they still didn't know if the content was true. Therefore, Emilione took Renevin, Jessie, and the monkeys ready to check it. On the way, the saint briefly recounted that the letter contained quite cruel things. But since the message was from the imperial family, Jessie hoped it was a bad joke. He worried that the content was so detailed. If the letter was false, the author would pay. It spoke of an experimental subject, which meant punishment for the palace. The palace's actions had already exceeded human comprehension, so Emilione wasn't very surprised. But the ransom request hit her before she left the empire. Prince Yuan's letter wouldn't leave her mind, and she fought against giving in to emotions. Upon arriving at the palace, Renevin immediately started shouting for the saint to move aside. The servants dared not disobey, but they were alarmed by her mood. The saint and her entourage advanced decisively, determined to reach their destination as soon as possible. However, one of the subjects begged her to wait, but Emilione only demanded to know where the emperor was. Her tone was so irritated that the servant did not dare to report immediately. But then, hesitating, he explained that His Majesty was currently in the backyard. Thanking him for the answer, the girl advanced again, nearly bumping Servant Balchin with her shoulder. She had heard that everyone who had a chance to claim the throne was dead, and apparently they left this child for experiments. The letter reveals that Prince Yuan's mother is an elf, which means His Highness is a half-elf. Elves heal thanks to their great life energy, so the prince can probably do it too. Now he is a guinea pig and a walking first aid kit if someone from the royalty gets hurt. According to the letter, the prince heals any wound, so the palace will no longer depend on the temple, but they experiment on him because, after healing a serious wound, he cannot use his power for a while. That is, his abilities have their disadvantages. In no time, Emilione reached her destination, and His Majesty greeted her as if nothing had happened. Moreover, He expected that she would now be willing to have a normal conversation. Without beating around the bush, and with an angry face, the saint declared that she would no longer tolerate such treatment. The emperor was outraged. First she says she's leaving the empire, and now she doesn't like how he treats her. It seemed Emilione's words meant nothing to him, but she endured and asked Renaven to summon sacred priests and knights to the palace. His Majesty was indignant that the saint was giving orders so calmly in his palace, and demanded explanations. The young woman only asked him not to worry so much, but he wouldn't calm down. It was the ruling family's territory, and she was violating those rights. The saint reminded him how he himself sent his knights to the temple, and now she was doing the same. That time, the emperor also asked her not to worry. Now she was returning the favor. His Majesty's fury completely erupted, screaming like a madman that she could not compare herself to him, and that she had no right to command there. But Emilione was only acting as His Majesty had acted towards her. In the temple, it is forbidden for strangers to impose their rules, especially people like the emperor. The ruler of the state became completely enraged and instinctively grabbed his sword. However, Emilione expected this kind of reaction from him and calmly snapped her fingers, which caused the throne behind His Majesty to shatter. To the astonished emperor, she only explained that her fingers moved accidentally, and she apologized, but warned him that if he forced her to repeat herself, she would do something much worse. Then she left Renee, Ben, and Jessie there, and she herself went somewhere else. The letter said that Prince Ewan was locked up at the end of the Rose Path, next to the Scarlet Wall, but the palace territory is too large to find the prince with only this clue. Unexpectedly, Ulwa appeared near Emilione again, and it's unknown how he knew where she would be, but he pretended he was nearby and saw her by chance, and also offered his help. Emilione immediately asked if His Highness had seen a boy, about 12 years old, in the palace. She explained that he was a boy in whose veins ran the blood of a fantastic race. Now, the saint was even glad that Ulwa was there. This way she could prove her usefulness. Upon realizing they were thinking of the same child, His Highness agreed to tell everything. Furthermore, he knows the Rose Path on the Scarlet Wall well and will surely be able to help the saint. The girl thanked him and promised to protect him in case of danger. To this, His Highness only smiled sweetly and asked her not to make such promises. He is very pleased to help the saint and is ready to protect her himself at all times. He spoke very cunningly. It was another phrase to conquer Emilione. He also remembered that the saint always protects someone, and there is nothing wrong with being the one protected. The girl knew that his words were probably false, but they comforted her heart. Moreover, it sounded very nice, and Emilione loved romantic things. Later they reached the Rose Path, and the prince warned that every rose bush had a spell. Even if you cut them, new ones will soon grow and release poison. Noticing the saint's heels, Ulwa explained that it was not the right footwear, and he offered to carry her in his arms. Emilione refused, but the prince asked her to see it as a way to thank her for saving the people. And instantly, he lifted her into his arms, like a feather. The girl didn't even have time to say a word. Then, brandishing a dagger, Ulwa cleared the way for them, cutting thorns and rushing forward. It seemed that it was not a path of roses, but a path of real horror and trials. Emilione only looked back at the pieces of branches falling, as they seemed like living beings. She realized that if they simply went in there, something terrible would happen. Then, Ulwa asked the saint to close her eyes, as he didn't want her to see the cruel actions of some soldiers. The girl did not reply and buried her face in His Highness's shoulder, although she believed that if those magically created soldiers turned out to be monsters, she could handle it. However, for that she would need to open her eyes. Right now, Ulwa asked her to stay in that position, as he was facing walking corpses. To him, they were just withered and decomposed remains that dragged and moved. He even felt a bit uncomfortable that the saint had to endure the stench emanating from them. Soon they reached the indicated spot, and Aloys allowed Emilione to open her eyes. They were now in a decent clearing, and His Highness gently placed the saint on the ground. Ahead stood a building covered in vines, exactly what she was looking for. A little further, Emilia saw a blonde boy cheerfully chasing a butterfly. His aura was even more intense than that of the priests. It was Prince Ewan. Seeing a stranger, the boy stopped and looked at her with surprise. He then explained that no strangers should be there and asked who she was. The saint explained that she had come by invitation from His Highness, who was suffering from an illness. And at that moment, the boy realized that she was the saint. He was happy that Emilia had arrived as the professor said not to wait for a response. The young woman took the boy's face in her hands and told him that she could not ignore his request. Suddenly, she felt something strange, and a sense of alertness invaded her. She started infusing him with divine power, and it immediately filtered through. His wound was, obviously, very deep. Then, Emilione pulled up the boy's sleeve and noticed that his entire arm was covered in bruises. Afterwards, Yuan confessed that he wanted to receive help from the saint before she left the empire. And now, he was very grateful, as he didn't expect her to respond so quickly. Next to the saint, the little prince saw a man, and she explained that he was her friend. Later, at tea time, Yuan confessed that it was the first time someone had come at his invitation. Awa became curious to know if there was anyone else there, besides his little highness. The boy asked her to call him only by his name, as he did not consider himself a prince. He then explained that there were actually many people there, and they changed every month. And he does not consider himself a prince, because the emperor does not consider him a person, so he does not deserve the title of prince. Alwa could agree with the emperor, as the boy not only had human blood. Yuan confirmed his words, adding that this is precisely why they kept him there. Seeing that the little one became sad, Alwa corrected himself, saying that the prince was beautiful. Because of his uniqueness, he is much more beautiful than a mere mortal, and it is human to desire what one does not have. And His Majesty is one of those humans. Alwa explained to the boy that the emperor did not want to let him out because of his beauty. The little prince's face became increasingly astonished, and he confessed that he would love to go outside, even if just once outside. Yuan, seeing their thoughtful looks, understood that his wish was too big, but the saint immediately declared that she would take care of getting him out of there. Stroking his blonde hair, she begged him to trust her. For the little one it was a yearning, but he feared that the wise men would get angry with the saint. With a slight smile, Emilione assured him that she was stronger than those wise men and would surpass them. The boy was also afraid that the emperor might get angry. To this, Alwa asked Yuan to think about who the real ruler of this world was, and turning to Emilione, he proudly declared that it was the saint, since nothing in the whole world is above her, and her power is the greatest. Still, Yuan was worried, believing that the sanctuary was under the emperor's power. It was obvious that this child was misinformed, and Emilione would like to take care of his education. At that moment, a crowd of people came out of the palace looking for the prince. Seeing the number of people, Aloy supposed that escaping would be very complicated. But the saint didn't think it was a big problem and proposed to make quite a scene. She meant that since the prince is her, he was there too. They should leave in style. The girl approached the wall and pulled one of the vines that completely covered it. The saint imbued that branch with divine power, and it began to emit an intense glow, which then spread throughout the plant, and the branches began to separate. Yuan loved the spectacle, and Alwa clarified that it was just a taste of the saint's power. The way back was freer now, and Alwa congratulated Emilione on her great job. Alwa took the child in his arms, and an idea crossed his mind. Since they still had to meet the emperor, he didn't want the prince to get upset, and he put him to sleep. To do this, he used an oriental technique of sleep management and asked the saint not to worry, since it was not harmful. Emilione loved that trick and asked Alwa to teach her how to do it someday. His Highness didn't mind, especially since they would have many more opportunities later on. Then they returned, and on the way the saint got angry because the emperor was blocking the path to the sanctuary, and the knights followed his order obediently, as if there was nothing wrong with it. Alwa opined that those knights simply had no other option, as they could be punished for disobedience. It sounded convincing, but Emilione still felt dissatisfied. She considered it arrogant towards God's chosen one and understood her people very well, since if you don't take that into account, that person is not fit to be a leader. She noticed about her companion that his people had a very good master. Alwa even got a little embarrassed about being just the master and not someone they revered. Soon they returned to the garden area, where the emperor was guarded by priests and sacred knights. Renee Bentz was relieved that the saint finally returned, as the emperor's shouting was getting on his nerves. And he, seeing the little prince in Aloyse's arms, became enraged and wanted to snatch the child away. But Emilione blocked his way and looked at him as if she were ready to rip off those hands. Renee Bentz instantly jumped in, declaring that His Majesty had dared to lay a hand on the saint. Naturally, he began to shout that he wasn't going to touch her, but that she was blocking his way. The high priest replied with no less anger, that he would not forgive the emperor for touching the saint even with a finger. Their verbal argument continued, and Emilione herself declared that she would not allow His Majesty to touch her subjects and priests. The emperor's fury was unstoppable. He shouted like a ruffian, blaming Emilione. She didn't stay silent and threatened revenge for the invasion of the imperial palace into the sanctuary. Her gaze was hard, her voice furious, and it hurt His Majesty that a girl, even a saint, contradicted him. However, he understood that if he lost Yuan, he wouldn't be able to calm the negative atmosphere. And more calmly, he asked Prince Su to hand over that child to him. Emilione decided to embellish the truth and claimed that the boy had only gotten lost, and they found him in the palace. Moreover, she did not believe it was right to leave that child in such a place. What's more, she wasn't going to ask the emperor for permission. Then she smiled enigmatically and suggested that His Majesty knew that child. Obviously, he couldn't admit it and only gnashed his teeth. It enraged him that the letters were now on the saint's side, and he dared to suggest out loud that he was His Majesty's son, so loud that everyone could hear. After that, even the servants were shocked. Almost no one knew that His Majesty had another offspring. People were murmuring that the emperor was hiding his son. Everyone knew he only had the crown prince. With a guilty look, he explained that the existence of this child was kept secret due to an illness, and to deceive those who pose a threat to the crown prince. It was necessary to deceive even the empire's ally, the sanctuary, and hide this child from them. Even him. Emilione was enraged that the emperor was now justifying himself after not treating Juinu like a child, and declared that since he deceived the ally, he became her enemy. Approaching the emperor almost glued to him, she also declared that she personally was not his ally. Then she turned away, while His Majesty once again poured out his anger. Only his screams didn't affect Emilione, as she believed he considered her a mere empty shell. But she reminded him that the task of adults is to care for children, and since the emperor does not do so, their paths separate. The saint no longer wishes to meet His Majesty face to face, who treats her so poorly. Then she remembered that she was leaving the empire, and with a smile, she hoped the emperor was happy now. It seems the rumors about the saint's departure haven't reached everyone yet, and they are worried about the empire. Emilione declared that the young prince is physically and morally exhausted after some suspicious experiments. Therefore, he will be sent to a sanctuary, and they will care for him there until he is completely recovered. For the emperor, that was the last straw. He even gathered his courage and wanted to lunge at the saint. But the young woman immediately called the priests and ordered them to sweep away anyone who tried to stand in her way. His Majesty could no longer do anything, and Emilione, along with Ilwa and Yuan, left that place. Ilwa couldn't believe that someone locked the young prince in a castle and used him. Meanwhile, Emilione thought it was time to ask the question that was gnawing at her, and she asked directly how Ilwa knew that Prince Yuan was locked up there. His Highness did not want to reveal his secret, and he hoped the saint would understand. Most likely, this man already realized that Emilione had unmasked him. Then he suggested that the saint should announce to the people again that she was leaving for another country. She did not argue and decided to do it the following week, when there is a party at the palace. Then she will declare again that she is leaving this empire. After returning to the sanctuary and lodging Yuan, Emilione sank into her thoughts. The last conversation with Ilwa kept running through her mind. She was curious about what other countries would be like. Renaven advised her to think carefully before leaving, but since the sanctuary is not tied to any place, Emilione was not going to change her mind. The high priest was intrigued by what had led the saint to make that decision. The answer was simple. She decided to trust Prince Alois, his convictions and ambitions, and since it is her own choice, Emilione does not regret it in the slightest. For her, that prince was a man who hid his feelings behind a mask and created 1,000 scenarios. Moreover, he is skilled at guiding others in the right direction. Renaven noticed that the saint had changed, and she did not deny that she was constantly deviating from the path. She herself was curious because she often took the wrong path. But in any case, she will not regret her choice and will not return to this empire. The girl thought that if she had taken the wrong path, she now just had to walk it in order to grow. After those words, the high priest thanked the saint and declared that he was very happy to serve her. A week later, a party was organized at the palace, and obviously there were many nobles there. And when the saint appeared, they no longer looked at her with as much contempt as before. They greeted her appropriately and paid her compliments, probably hoping she would change her mind about leaving. In any case, public opinion was now on Emilione's side. In the hall, Prince Ilwa was waiting for her, and the aristocrats moved aside as they approached each other. Prince Essia greeted the saint as was proper, and she also blessed him. Then, kissing her hand, the young man asked how she had spent the night, hoping it had been quiet. The people who saw this scene started whispering again that those two were very close. Meanwhile, Cassandra asked her father if it wasn't time for them to return Ewan to his place. But he considered that, for the saint, it was smarter to make a proposal than to offend her. And when Emilione approached the emperor, he confessed that he wished to tell her something important. Then he looked at Ilwa and declared that marrying the saint to a son from another state was degrading. Therefore, he decided to propose marriage and marry her to Crown Prince Cassandra. It seems that it was news even to the prince himself, and he wanted to object, but his father wouldn't let him say a word. Afterwards, he addressed the saint again, hoping such a proposal would be enough for her. However, Emilione had no intention of retracting her decision to leave the empire. She even winked at Prince Ilwa so that he would confirm her words. And he, to convince everyone, especially the emperor, gently touched the saint's cheek, implying that she was leaving with him. Perhaps they overdid it a bit, but it worked. The emperor stumbled out of the hall and didn't even maintain that dignity he boasted so much about in front of the saint. Upon returning to the sanctuary, Emilione saw the little prince and asked him what he was doing. The boy ran to hug them. He had been locked up all day and missed them. The saint noticed that his wounds had almost healed, and soon he could go for a walk. But first, she asked him to read some books. The boy was happy to be able to play in the garden, even if he had to study first. Moreover, the saint guaranteed him that he was safe now. After hugging His Highness, she asked him to also focus on his recovery. She also planned to introduce him to someone, and tomorrow he would come to the visitors' lounge. Ilwa asked the saint about her plans for the little prince. He was sure that Emilia already had everything planned. Now the most important thing is to take care of the child, which the priests will take care of in her absence. She understood the responsibility, but she wasn't foolish enough to refuse the opportunity to advance. Moreover, she chose the country of Ezi because she considers it suitable for the interests of the common people. Emilia didn't feel capable of doing it alone, so she sought Ilwa's support. The prince objected, pointing out that she still controlled corruption in the empire well. She opened an orphanage in the city and reduced the enormous taxes that the aristocrats charged the people. Ilwa considered all of this a great achievement of the saint. She herself believed that she hadn't done much in the year and a half she had been in the empire. She even suspected that her actions had done more harm than good. She was scared and afraid to move forward. That's why she needed someone brave and competent, who is capable of taking the initiative and compensating for her shortcomings. That's how she saw Prince Esai. By then, Ilwa had realized that he was the person Emilione needed. He hugged her tenderly and asked if it made sense to keep waiting, if they needed each other. Meanwhile, Prince Cassandra was furious about what was happening. It enraged him that those two not only took Ewan away, but now they were mocking the imperial family. His Highness cursed them, when suddenly there was a knock at his door. Then it opened with a soft creak, and the head of the young duchess appeared. Ronla, true to style, started flattering the prince, saying she had been looking for him for a long time. And she confessed that she was shocked when she arrived at the hall and found no one. Then she noticed the prince's hand was injured and screamed as if her nails had been torn off. Then she started asking who had done that to him, suspecting something happened at the party. But Cassandra pulled back his hand, which she had grabbed, and explained that the saint plans to leave the empire. Ronla was a little surprised, although she had heard similar rumors. Then she became very indignant that the saint dared to disobey his majesty and contact a prince. The duchess thought they should go to the saint right away and prevent her from leaving the empire. A mocking smile appeared on her face when she suggested that the prince should not let her go just like that. Cassandra stopped to think. There was truth in the young lady's words, and she kept nodding, saying that Emilione must be at the sanctuary right now. The next day, the saint instructed the little prince, helping him read various stories. The boy loved it, and she allowed him to ask for more books when he finished those. At that moment, Chen burst into the room, literally impatient to see the saint. Running to hug her, the little girl thanked Emilione once again for the good care. It was then that the saint decided to introduce these two little ones. Upon learning that a real prince was in front of her, Chen became overjoyed and approached him. The girl turned out to be quite communicative and talkative, while Ewan was somewhat stunned. Their cheerful meeting was interrupted by the shout of the crown prince, who entered forcefully. Behind him followed Duchess Ronla silently, and Emilione understood they were plotting something. Cassandra wanted to have a serious talk with the saint, but he was speechless when he saw Ewan there. Emilione hid the little one behind her back and demanded explanations from the prince, why he had returned, and he calmly declared that they had not finished their conversation in the palace. But for the saint, that was no excuse. She was furious that he continued to show her such disrespect. Moreover, he showed up unannounced. The prince replied that the sanctuary doors were open to everyone. Ronla nodded servilely, saying that His Highness had spent precious time to get there. However, the saint didn't want to waste her time on a talk she considered useless. This, again, infuriated His Highness. But Emilione had not finished her speech, and she sentenced that the crown prince must apologize to her immediately. Right now, the atmosphere was getting tense. Chen, seeing the saint agitated, approached and pulled her sleeve. Emilione understood that the girl was scared and reprimanded the prince for terrifying the children. Her fury erupted again towards the intruder, tired of playing along. Both the prince and the duchess were in shock. They didn't expect that from the saint. Ronla tried to say that Emilione was going too far, but she immediately shut her up and asked her to think carefully about who was actually going too far. Afterwards, she sat next to the little ones and apologized for them witnessing that scene. Ronla wouldn't calm down and insisted that the saint listen to the crown prince. The girl sensed that it was something important, since he couldn't wait for the banquet to talk. But she didn't care in the slightest, as her mocking smile made clear. Furious, Cassandra threatened not to stand idly by while the saint left the empire. He would have problems if Emilione left him the throne, wouldn't he? So again, he asked her to deeply reflect on what she already possesses. And when His Highness understands, Emilione will be ready to talk to him. At that moment, the saint received another visitor, none other than Prince Eloi. He noticed she had company, but she asked him not to worry, as they were leaving soon. Then, Eloi politely greeted the little ones, and first approached Prince Yuyan. His Highness was very happy that the child looked more cheerful and was improving. Meanwhile, the saint, turning around, politely dismissed Cassandra and his friend, indicating that a priest would show them the way out. The crown prince wanted to object, but he remembered her request to think about what he could enjoy everything thanks to. And he stopped halfway, conscious of the mess he had gotten himself into. Lady Nestrin noticed his reaction, but it seemed she wasn't going to accept the situation and was plotting something. Later, Renee Ben was explaining the details of organizing banquets to the saint. Because it wasn't his strong suit, he only told her the essentials, thinking that Emilione didn't need to memorize everything, and that, in reality, it would be enough for her just to honor the guests with her presence. Emilione became curious to know why such events had never been held in the sanctuary before. She understood they had financial troubles, but they had a suitable hall. It turns out that previous saints didn't much like banquets. They preferred to observe the world silently from above, and banquets seemed too noisy to them. Emilione thought differently. Important decisions can be made at banquets, and in her case, she had to engrave in her memory the face of the empire they would soon leave. Just in case, Emilione asked Renee Ben once more if he regretted leaving with her. But it couldn't be otherwise. After all, he is the high priest and the closest to the saint, and his dwelling is the sanctuary, which is located in every country. Saying this, Renee Ben placed his hand over his heart and knelt before the saint, who thanked him for his support. Preparation for the event went smoothly, and the big day soon arrived. Emilione bestowed her blessing upon the people who greeted her fervently, and when she opened the door to the hall, it seemed to her that she was a little late for the celebration. There, Renee Ben immediately greeted her, and the saint blessed everyone gathered. Moreover, she sincerely wished the guests to enjoy today's event with all their hearts. The party had been going on for a while, but Emilione, at one point, started to feel bored. But then she heard a familiar voice. Unexpectedly, Lady Nestor presented herself before her. She wasn't alone. By her side were His Highness Cassandra, Duke Cajun, and Prince Eloi. The saint blessed them, the first two rather out of formality, and then asked Renavin to order the servants to serve her wine. The crown prince also requested Elisio's wine, but Emilione interrupted him, explaining that Renavin is the high priest, not a servant carrying out orders from the emperor's son. The priest noticed that the saint was starting to get irritated and wanted to calm her down a bit, but the servants just arrived, and throwing a furious look at Cassandra, he declared that he could address the servant directly. Such a tone offended the crown prince, but he made an effort to remain composed, and beckoning the servant with his fingers, he ordered him to bring those. Ulwa was even surprised that His Highness was going to drink that, as Elysio's is a very strong drink. But it was just what the crown prince needed to calm his nerves. At that moment, the saint decided to excuse herself from the guests for a moment. First, she addressed His Highness Aloys, thanking him for visiting them today. She was worried that he couldn't accompany them that day. Knowing that Emilione was expecting him, Prince Esse felt delighted. He even blushed a little. Suddenly, a suspicious noise was heard coming from where Lady Nestro was. A broken glass lay beside her. There was a red stain on her dress, and Duke Cashin began to hum to her, worried about her condition. The servant, with a trembling voice, apologized and prepared to clean everything up immediately. But then Emilione took his hand, noticing that he himself had cut himself on the fragments. Right after, she asked him not to worry and used a bit of her divine power to heal his wounds. Then, the servant explained that he stumbled and fell on the fragments, and the saint looked at the holy prince. The previous time, the servants also accidentally broke a jar of candies. Probably, like then, they will blame the servant and not investigate who is guilty. But Emilione believed the servant's words. Now she decided to change the script her own way and asked that man not to worry. The saint approached the distressed Lady Nestra, asking how she was, although it was visible on her face. Still, Ronla declared that she hadn't been injured, but her expensive dress was now ruined. To everyone's surprise, the Duchess did not blame the servant, but rather called the crown prince's attention, complaining about the stain. For Emilione, this was even favorable. It would distract the attention of her and Aloys. Cassidra was neither indignant nor grumbled for any reason, but rather addressed Lady Nestra. And after promising her a new dress, he even asked her not to be harsh with the servant. The saint looked at both of them and did not recognize the prince, but perhaps he heeded her advice. Moreover, the emperor's son approached the servant and asked how he felt. Even the servant was in shock. It seemed they had changed this man. Meanwhile, Ulwa did not miss the opportunity to approach the saint. He was also intrigued by Cassidra's change. Then, Emilione focused again on the suffering face of the young duchess, and she asked her not to worry, as they would prepare another dress for her immediately. She also noticed that Duke Cashin's sleeve was damaged and proposed accompanying them. The three headed towards the guest room, when suddenly, something crossed Ronla's mind again. Pretending to be an innocent little sheep, she mumbled that she didn't want to be a burden at the saint's party, and that she was leaving. Duke Cashin wanted to reply, but Emilione intervened and, calming the Duchess, she allowed him to leave the event if he preferred so. Thanking the saint for her grace, Lady Nestro quickly headed for the exit. Cashin, however, was curious why Emilione was taking care of that, since it was the servant's job. But she couldn't stand on the sidelines, as her dear guests had suffered. Moreover, the priests are not their servants. She was even curious to know what the Duke thought of the priests, and he expressed that these people dedicate their lives to serving God and the saint, and they also help the nobility and the common people. Unexpectedly, Emilione asked him to be quiet. He was speaking quite loudly, and Lady Nestro, who hadn't gone far yet, heard his words. He didn't understand what was happening and assumed he had said something wrong. Emilione understood that the Duke never thought about the sacrifice of the priests. She reminded him that taking care of the people is also the duty of the nobility. Realizing his mistake, the Duke apologized to the saint with a bow. She didn't expect apologies, as most nobles think the same. But Cashin insisted on apologizing, admitting his lack of vision. Then he asked permission to add something, recalling the lamp and his inability to protect her. He swore that, even if Ronla was nearby, the saint would be his absolute priority. Afterwards, they dressed Duke Cashin in a suit that fit him perfectly. He apologized again for the trouble, but Emilione was already sick of so many apologies. She asked him to stop, and Anisis apologized again, causing a grimace on the saint's face. Then, she knew the Duke would stay here for Cassidra, even though Lady Nestra had already left. Moreover, she didn't think the crown prince would also leave the party soon. Let's remember how he treated the injured servant. It seems he really listens to the saint's advice, which means His Highness is desperate to keep her. And Emilia understood that all that kindness is just a farce to make her change her mind. Returning to the hall, she noticed His Highness was talking with Prince Eze. Apparently, their talk was proceeding well, and the saint decided to approach them. She asked the Duke to entertain himself with something and headed towards the guests. Seeing her, Prince Eloi was glad that she had finally returned, and his face lit up with happiness. Moreover, he didn't think she had delayed, since the party can last as long as the hostess wishes. Emilia couldn't argue with that in any way, but she noticed that the music had stopped playing, although she didn't know the reason. Approaching, Eloi explained that even the gods of music ran out of breath before her beauty. His face was so close to hers that the girl blushed a little, but the boy was just carried away by his feelings, even more so since rumors were already circulating about it. She was right, the saint again noticed how people whispered looking at them, and only the crown prince was not happy about this, and his anger began to manifest. At that moment, a lady approached the couple, consumed by curiosity and gathering courage. She asked what kind of relationship united Emilia and Eloi. The saint thought it was rude to discuss her relationship with the prince in front of so many guests. Eloi came to the rescue and asked the lady to ask him any questions she wanted. Cassandra noticed with a smile that Prince Esse was obsessed with protecting the saint. For an instant, a tense pause took over everyone. Then, Emilione remembered that the crown prince had protected her himself recently, and Eloi added again, assuring that he sincerely wished to serve the saint and protect her. Moreover, a prince like him is more than enough to defend Saint Emilione. His words flattered the girl, but deeply hurt the prince, who bared his teeth like a rabid dog. Ignoring his anger, Eloi kissed the saint's hand and started chatting near her again. Then he thanked Cassandra, because thanks to him he could fulfill his dream, and that makes him very happy. It seemed he was mocking his highness, and judging by his reaction, he was succeeding very well. Later, Emilione was in her room with a glass of wine, remembering how fun her day had been. Although, being a saint, she could no longer taste the intoxicating flavor. Today, she wanted to drink a little. Just as she was bringing the glass to her lips, a young lord approached her. He had green hair and introduced himself as Eswa Kerwin, the count's son. Upon hearing that name, the girl rummaged through her memory and remembered a guy with the same one. Definitely, the person in front of her was not the one she knew. And claiming that using someone else's name was improper, she demanded he tell her who he really was. The young count changed his expression to one of bewilderment and asserted that he was Eswa. Moreover, he insisted that he was the same Eswa whom Emilione had rejected in the past. Then he revealed that he had resorted to a wizard from the east, who had changed his appearance. Thinking that this man had problems with his appearance, the saint asked him to tell her the reason. The boy seemed a little hesitant, embarrassed to confess it, but blurted out a declaration that he wished to change so as not to embarrass the saint. The girl was stunned. It seems she got another fanatic who wished to become handsome just because she rejected him, and now he hopes for a second chance. Falling to his knees before Emilione, Ejuala looked like a loyal puppy and asked her out on a date. Completely confused, the saint tried to explain that the reason for her rejection was not his appearance, but he insisted that he could become as handsome a man as the many who hover around the saint. And now he declared that he would not move from there until she accepted his feelings. Emilione got a headache. She didn't understand why some people were so stubborn, and to avoid this useless talk, she decided to leave herself if he liked sitting on the floor so much. But then something strange and terrible happened. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw that guy reach his hands out towards her. She didn't have time to react because he turned out to be quite fast. He grabbed her hands and pulled her to the floor, and he loomed over her with a crazy look. He was close to drooling. The boy demanded explanations. Why didn't the saint accept him even after he became so handsome? At that moment, he seemed so repulsive to her, and she reaffirmed that she had done well to reject him. That idiot remained, convinced that the saint had rejected him because he wasn't handsome enough. And Emilione explained to him that a person's true beauty lies within, and that shy Eswa was much more pleasing to her than what he had become now. The green-haired boy cried like a child, not believing the saint's words. And this tender moment was interrupted by Prince Alois, who came to visit Emilione. Obviously, he was infuriated that an idiot dared to touch the saint and even threw her to the floor. Grabbing the scoundrel by the neck, he started scolding him while glaring at him. In a fit of rage, Eloi shoved the insolent one to the floor, and he rolled across the room. Eswa cried again, saying he had become handsome so that the saint would love him. The prince might understand, but the guest's disgusting behavior was getting on his nerves. Only Emilione stopped him, as her headache worsened due to the fight between them. They had to calm this fanatic down, and she asked him what he had liked about her the previous time. According to his account, that time Emilione, unlike other ladies, looked at him intently and smiled. She was like a beautiful rose among the repulsive buds of a weed. And at that moment, Eswa understood that his heart belonged only to her. But alas, he failed. The young woman realized that in the past, she had not judged Eswa solely on his appearance. But precisely for that very reason, she hadn't rejected him either. The situation was now very awkward, and the Count's son apologized to the saint for his action. A short time later, that guy left the sanctuary, and shortly after, Emilione met Prince Eloi. They decided to organize a small romantic date under the starry sky in the bright moonlight. They would also take the opportunity to discuss some pending matters that had accumulated. The saint couldn't get Eswa out of her head, and she reiterated that she hadn't rejected him because of his looks. His Highness didn't argue that, but he is sure that she chose him for his attractiveness. And he is also sure that in the future, there will be those who try to get close to her using their beauty. And he asked the saint not to deal with that, to leave those fanatics to him. Emilione agreed, and they spent the rest of the night in a pleasant and romantic atmosphere. That same night, Prince Cassandra met with Duchess Ronla and told her that he had gone to see the saint, as she had asked him to. Lady Nestro was surprised by how closely related Emilia and Eloi were, and Alois. However, the prince was more worried about not having been able to express his desire to stay in the empire. Ronal now considered it useless. Moreover, the envoy Eswa had also failed. She never thought she would worry so much about preventing the saint from leaving the empire. She remembered how the Marquis's son, as a sign of his feelings, gave her the holy book she had requested. The reason she wanted to get that book was that it contained information on how to get rid of the saint. There is a poison possessed by certain magical beings, which even the saint neutralizes slowly. Ronla devised a plan to seal the saint, which is why she sent monsters several times. But Emilione, on the contrary, protected the Duchess from them and even tamed the creatures that attacked her. That's when everything went wrong. The saint became stronger than her predecessors and could unmask Ronla. This led Lady Nestro to think that she was the one who could help her achieve her true goal. Another sinister plan crossed her mind, and she asked His Highness to listen to her. Ronla will secretly follow Emilione and try to convince her to return to the empire. It might sound dangerous, but she begged the prince not to worry about anything. And if the situation becomes critical, Lady Nestor will ask the saint herself for help. And if the princess proves her loyalty by traveling abroad, this might work. It was time to leave, and all the inhabitants of the sanctuary came out to bid farewell to Emilione. The saint, just in case, asked Jessie to review her instructions, and she, like a paternoster, recited that she must take care of Prince Yu Yen and the little monkeys. Tears welled up in her eyes when she saw the saint leaving, but she asked her not to be sad. The priests holding the monkeys looked haggard from the sadness of the farewell, but everyone understood that she needed it, and Emilione urged Renee Ben, as it was time to leave. And as they boarded the carriage, Jessie begged them not to forget them and to come back soon. As they said goodbye, the saint waved her hand to them and asked everyone to be in their place when she returned. At the pier by the sea, Ronla was a bit sad because her cousin was leaving. And although he assured her that they would have many opportunities to see each other, Lady Nestro was still somewhat displeased. The crown prince approached and asked when Emilione was supposed to arrive. They informed him that the saint would arrive at any moment, and just as Prince Alois finished speaking, they saw her carriage approaching. Cassandra even became saddened when he realized that Emilione was truly leaving the empire. Only Ronla smiled discreetly, happy with her performance and thinking about the next step of her plan. Linking arms with the crown prince, she asked him not to be upset, as the saint would return soon. But for some reason, her touch felt unpleasant to him, and he abruptly pulled his hand away. Lady Nestro understood that he couldn't keep that woman, and now he was taking out his anger on her. The saint's carriage approached and stopped. Renaven was the first to get out. Then he offered his hand to Emilione to make it easier for her to exit, and she kindly thanked him. Immediately Prince Eloi approached her and greeted her with a sweet and sincere smile. And the saint, seeing the whole crowd come out to greet her, thanked them for waiting. The happiest of all was Eloi, who would accompany Emilione to her kingdom. Ronla, for her part, feigned sadness about the farewell. She even prepared a handkerchief to blow her nose. But the saint asked her not to be too sad, as she was only leaving for another country, not to die. At the same time, she noticed that the Duchess was crying, and the crown prince was like a log. Without comforting her, Only when the conversation with Ronla ended did he dryly ask when the saint planned to return to the empire. The young woman could not give an exact answer. Moreover, it was time to prepare to board the ship. Finally, she thanked Prince Cassidra for having cared about the servants at the banquet. It sounded like an aside, but the prince only blushed and asked the saint to take care of herself, and that everyone would await her return. The last farewell ritual was Emilione's blessing to everyone who saw her off. Already from the deck, she begged Lady Nestra to take care of herself, promising that time would fly, and they would meet again soon. Wishes came back from the pier, and even Cassidra shouted that the saint must return without fail. When the ship moved away from the coast, the crown prince reminded the duchess that it was time to take the next step. The young woman was completely determined to follow Emilione and bring her back by any means necessary. The saint went down to the cabin and was delighted with the place. Since her companions didn't want her to feel uncomfortable, they made an effort to make her stay on the ship pleasant. The young woman sat on the soft bunk and invited the high priest to sit next to her. It was unexpected for him, but the saint wanted him to also feel the softness of the bed. Settling his backside there, Renee Ben admitted it was very comfortable. But then Emilione noted Ulwai's downward curved lips and understood that he was jealous. Then she calmed him down, saying it was foolish to be jealous of the high priest, as his main duty is to protect her. The saint's words took effect, and the prince invited her for a walk on the deck and to breathe fresh air. The idea seemed good to her, and she started getting ready, although now Renaven had an unhappy face. Later, admiring the immensity of the sea, Ulwa proposed showing Emilione another country before arriving. The girl did not object, and the prince briefly told her that it was a country where beauty harmonizes with luxury. He is sure that the saint will like that place, and she felt expectant. In reality, she didn't quite understand why they should stop in other countries along the way, and she decided that Ulwa was plotting something. At first the journey seemed wonderful, but very soon, Emilio felt the full effects of seasickness and lay almost lifeless. The prince comforted her as best he could, and their pleasant conversation helped the saint feel a little better. Ulwa even felt a certain pride. Not everyone gets to see a saint vulnerable, but Emilione didn't feel like his last words were well-intentioned. The prince touched her forehead to confirm she didn't have a fever. Everything was fine, and he suggested she sleep so her stomach would calm down. He didn't take his hand away and stroked her forehead so she would fall asleep quickly, and he remembered how he used to lull Yuyan, stroking his head the same way. The prince thought those attentions were necessary for the saint, and approaching, he asked her permission to request something from her. In his opinion, Emilione should not only show her strong side to be a saint. He massaged her neck, helping her relax so she would fall asleep soon. At first she felt clumsy and defenseless, but then she let herself be carried away by the prince's care. 4 days have passed since they set sail, but Emilione couldn't get over the seasickness. Not even an outdoor walk helped, and the pale look of her face worried Renaven. But the saint asked him not to worry, as they would arrive soon and she would feel well again. Ulwa approached them and cheered them up with the news that they would soon arrive in the kingdom of Beaumont. It is the place he had spoken of, and he repeated that its capital was incredibly beautiful. However, the saint was not in a state to appreciate the beauties of the city. She just wanted to reach solid ground. The prince even felt uncomfortable, as he had promised a comfortable journey, and his efforts were in vain, but he promised that Emilione would be the first to disembark, since tradition dictates that the person of highest status should do so. While they chatted a little more, a sailor informed His Highness that they had already arrived at the kingdom of Beaumont. Ulwa offered his hand to Emilione and asked for permission to accompany her. Once on the coast, the girl was glad the seasickness was over. She would even kiss the ground, but then she noticed a crowd waiting for her, whispering about her appearance and status. The first to approach the saint was the local king, Asibio Beaumont, who was short in stature. With a huge crown, Emilione greeted him courteously and wished him God's blessing. She learned that there would also be orphanages in this kingdom, but the king's jewels caught her attention, so her first impression wasn't the best. It seemed that luxury had gone too far. Selling the jewels from just one of the king's outfits could feed hundreds of poor people for a week. Next, Prince Ulwa greeted the king and paid him a compliment on his appearance. Asibio recognized Prince Esse and noticed that the boy was much thinner than he expected. Then, glancing at the man in the robe, the king supposed he was the high priest, and he, introducing himself as Rinabane, bowed before his majesty and showed reverence. That both a saint and the high priest had arrived, the king considered it a good omen for his country. However, Ben glanced at his huge crown and the rings adorning almost every finger, and he advised that it would be better to go to an alchemist paying with jewels if the king wished to attract good energy. But the king meant that the country would flourish, as they had been honored with divine grace. To this, Ben declared that the prosperity of the country depended entirely on the efforts of the king himself. Realizing it wasn't worth arguing, Asibio offered the saint a carriage that was almost entirely adorned with gold. However, Emilione wished to travel separately from the king. Although he explained that his carriage was spacious and that all the guests would fit perfectly inside, but the saint asked His Majesty not to worry, and his carriage seemed too luxurious to her. So she pointed to a simpler carriage, and Emilione expressed her desire to travel in it. She is sure that she and her companions will be more comfortable there. Asibio was in shock, not understanding why the saint chose such a humble carriage, as if she were ashamed of him, and he begged her to sit with him in the first carriage. But the girl clarified that she did not wish to travel with His Majesty, and looking at him severely, she hoped she wouldn't have to repeat it twice. It seems this annoyed the king, but he still ordered a separate carriage to be prepared for the guests, and the saint headed there, declaring that they would meet at the gates of the capital. On the way, Renaven couldn't stop marveling that not only the king's clothes, but also the carriages were very luxurious. Emilione also noticed that there was an excess of luxury and asked what he hadn't told Lois. It seemed to her that he had overlooked a crucial detail about that kingdom, but the prince did not give her a concrete answer. He only suggested observing what would happen next. To Renaven, for his part, it seemed that the kingdom was not that rich, but he didn't understand those expenses. The saint was also asking herself that question, since the king and the nobility looked very opulent. It was obvious that something was wrong, and Emilione looked at Elwar again with questioning eyes. With an enigmatic smile, the prince declared that it wouldn't be interesting if he told everything. But the saint was not in the mood for jokes, and her anger began to grow. The prince assured that if he revealed the secrets of the Beaumont kingdom, she would not see his true self. He wanted the saint to convince herself of the true situation of that state. Then, gently touching her cheek, the prince begged her not to get so angry, or she would get wrinkles. Later they arrived at the palace, and the saint and the high priest were wide-eyed. They had never seen such a dazzling building, covered in gold. Emilione observed it with admiration. It seemed the true embodiment of luxury, but I, the narrator, have a feeling that everything is a facade, just like an emerald city. Let's see what's behind it. The king approached Emilione from behind and asked if she liked his palace. They had tried their best for the saint's visit. Then he proposed going to the dining room, but the high priest noticed that the lady was still suffering from seasickness and advised taking her to her chambers first so she could rest well. The king agreed, but the high priest's chambers were not ready yet due to an oversight. So he suggested that Renaven stay in the temple until his rooms were prepared. For Renaven, it was like an unexpected slap, and he wanted to object, but the saint stopped him. And she asked if everything was ready for her and Prince Elwar to rest. Stretching his smile again on his chubby and wrinkled face, Asibio admitted that everything was prepared in advance. Hearing this, Emilione declared that, in that case, Renaven did not have to stay in the temple, since he could occupy the rooms intended for her. The high priest himself was very flustered. He could not allow himself to occupy the place reserved for the saint. But the king was more curious to know where Lady Emilione intended to spend the night in that case. Prince Aloys replied in his stead, proposing to share a room with him. If the saint did not object, the young woman agreed with his idea and proposed going to unpack. After this, they headed to the palace, while the king tried to hide his displeasure. First, he wanted to teach that high priest a lesson, and now the saint seems too haughty to him. Once inside, Renaven kept getting anxious about having to occupy Emilione's rooms, but she calmed him down by saying they would live there together, although that only made him more nervous, just like the prince, who thought they had agreed to live in her room. Moreover, Elwar will have to explain the situation to everyone who considers him Emilione's beloved. It was then that he realized that unpleasant rumors could arise, since she and Renaven spend a lot of time together. At that moment, they reached the prince's room, and the maid reported that everything was ready to settle in. Elwar was the first to head to the door, while Renaven kept asking the saint what to do. And then a great idea occurred to him. She would sleep alone, and Renaven would stay to live with Elwar. The high priest was happy that the saint was not staying with the prince, and the prince felt quite uncomfortable. Emilione, hoping they wouldn't argue, headed to the room, but the prince stopped her. And approaching, he leaned in as close as if he were about to kiss her. The young woman was amazed, thinking he would really kiss her at that moment, when suddenly he removed a feather from her hair that had gotten stuck. But the saint blushed. She felt uncomfortable for allowing such thoughts to enter her head, and she thanked him for his attention. After this, His Highness withdrew. But Emilione understood that something was wrong. Clearly, that man is playing with her, and most likely the feather situation was staged. And while she was lost in conjectures, Ulwa, as he left, occasionally glanced at her. Later, the saint was brought a luxurious fur coat and other outfits, tailored as if for a queen. The prince, who came to invite her to the dining room, noticed that the coat looked too bulky on her. In a fit of impulse, Emilione took it off, but she remembered that in that kingdom, beauty and luxury combined in harmony. Lois did not retract what he said, but he felt that the kingdom had become even stranger in her absence. Although all those clothes looked beautiful, they felt terribly heavy to the saint. But suddenly she smelled an unpleasant odor and became alert. The stench seeped into the room through the slightly open window, and the noise beginning to be heard from the street indicated to Emilione that monsters might have appeared. Outside, peeking out the window, the young woman noticed how the sky abruptly changed color, as if everything was covered in a sinister fog. She didn't see the monsters, and the saint understood that this was some kind of prophecy for her. The sky turned blue again, and Emilione was very curious to know what secrets this kingdom hid. Ulwa, on the way to the dining room, noticed that his companion was lost in thought, and she, smiling slightly, lied by saying she was thinking about her future and still couldn't believe he had chosen her. However, he considered her the most attractive woman he had ever met. He feels he has found what he was looking for, and Emilia thanked him for his warm words. Then she asked the prince to remember that time when she confessed that she wished to be recognized by her man. That moment was forever etched in Ulwa's memory, and now he remembers it very clearly. And now the saint asked him not to make her wait long for that dream to come true. His Highness tenderly kissed his fiancée's hand and assured her that she would know everything very soon. The royal family was already in the dining room and only waited for the foreign guests. Asibio tried to behave calmly, but the resentment over the saint's behavior did not leave him. And when they announced that the guests had arrived, he shouted at the children to stand up immediately as a sign of respect. Then, maintaining composure, he greeted the saint and the prince at dinner. The king even stood up and offered her a carved chair, indicating where she should sit. She appreciated his courtesy and thanked him. Upon sitting down, she congratulated René Ben on his work. The king interrupted the conversation, wishing to ask Emilione a pending question. The young woman paused briefly while a servant poured wine into her glass, and after taking a sip, she expressed her desire for silence at the table, implying to the king that he should shut up. This, of course, offended Asibio, but he did not dare to reply. But immediately, his daughter asked the saint for permission to ask her a question, and Emilione granted it. She didn't want to talk to the king, but those little prince and princess were adorable, unlike him, and the little girl asked why the holy lady had left the empire. For her age, the question was strange, but the saint kindly clarified that she only wanted to see other countries. Then they asked her if she intended to stay forever in Ez, with Prince Ulwa. And the saint, again, kindly explained to the children that she would return sometime, hoping that would be the last question for today, because she felt that the king had instructed the children to ask that, believing the saint would not refuse. And when the little ones fell silent, Asibio asked Prince Ulwa for a favor. He was very curious to know if there was a young princess among His Highness's sisters, and beautiful. At this question, the saint and the prince reacted ambiguously, but it was clear that this fat old man was looking for a wife who would become the queen of Beaumont. And so that the guests wouldn't think ill of him, Asibio, with a sad face, explained that the queen had died 3 months ago. Now he wanted a new wife, one as beautiful as his late queen. But then the saint decided to give the old pervert a couple of moral lessons, and she repeated his words, that his wife had passed away only 3 months ago. Then she reproached him, embarrassing him, that the king desired a wife so soon, and one who could be his daughter. Probably, Asibio didn't know what shame was, because he reacted abruptly with indignation, blushing with anger at the saint's cruel words. No matter how great her holiness was, she would not allow anyone to speak to her like that, and then Renévin became furious with him. Wishing to protect Emilione, He wanted to let loose a few nice things, but the girl asked him to calm down and declared that conversation with foolish people is useless. Looking at the king, the saint supposed he was not afraid of divine punishment at all. Of course, he was playing with words, and Eusebio immediately apologized for having flared up. But he did it as if the warning of punishment did not concern him. Now he tried to look tender towards the saint, but Emilione did not believe in his sincerity, and she warned him that if he disrespected her group again, he would face terrible consequences. His Majesty had nothing to say, and he tried to behave silently until the end of dinner. And Prince Eloi silently rejoiced that his future wife so skillfully put the king in his place. Later in the living room, His Highness asked if the saint liked the food. The young woman liked everything. Although the dessert seemed too sweet to her, Eloi liked her assessment. Since the cook is his spy, whom he infiltrated here 6 years ago, Emilione didn't quite understand him, and then the prince declared that there was poison in the food she ate. For an instant she was distressed, thinking her fiancé had gone mad and wanted to poison her. But it turned out to be a poison that doesn't affect her. It only affects a common person after months of use, and it is for the king. Even so, Emilione was annoyed and warned that she did not like men with secrets. The prince was not going to hide anything from the saint, or he wouldn't have even brought up the topic. And he explained that the first symptom of the poison is loss of taste. But by then, it's too late. Now Alois's bold confession seemed too much to Emilione. He plans to kill the royal family. His justification was that, for a foreign prince, the only way to kill the king is with poison. But the saint was infuriated that he could harm children, and without an explanation, she would punish him. Eloi didn't want the children to suffer and wanted to find another way. That's why he brought the saint. Understanding that the target is only His Majesty, Emilione asked the reason. But the prince believed that not even 1,000 words could describe it. It's better if she sees everything herself, but she will only be able to do so if she is ready to face the truth of what is happening in this country. The girl assured that she is much stronger than she looks and is ready for any horror. Moreover, she sees that the prince doesn't consider her that way either. Otherwise, he wouldn't have mentioned the engagement. But at the same time, he treats her like a small child who needs protection. Eloi apologized humbly. He just thought that Emilione was not ready for the reality of this state. Furthermore, he is sure that the saint will not be able to remain indifferent to the suffering of innocents. Moreover, His Highness considered himself unprepared and feared that his fiancée would suffer upon seeing the whole truth. Shortly after, Emilione went to see the high priest, who was reading quietly by the fireplace. But he was worried that the saint came to see him at this hour and asked what was happening. The girl confessed that a question was tormenting her, one she couldn't answer for hours. And she asked for advice on how much time she would need to prepare to encounter something. The high priest did not understand what preparation she was referring to, and Emilione relayed Prince Eloi's words to him, that she should be ready to know the truth about the kingdom. For some reason, this annoyed Renaven. He thought His Highness considered the saint's heart weak, as if he didn't notice the bravery with which she faced the emperor himself. The outburst of discontent even amused Emilione. But the high priest himself now felt uncomfortable, and his face turned crimson again. Then, the saint confessed that tomorrow she was going to personally check the situation in the kingdom and see everything with her own eyes. Moreover, she invited Renaven to go with her. The next morning, they informed the king that they were going to the temple, but he suggested staying at the palace. Emilione did not understand his protest. There is nothing strange about a saint going to the temple, and when Eusebio confessed that he wanted to talk to her, he asked her to wait whatever was necessary. Then he took Prince Eloi by the arm and proposed they set off. In the end, His Highness only bowed respectfully to the king, but he remained uneasy. And he warned the prince that he must bring the saint back to the palace. Yes or yes, it sounded like the threat of a good and strict father, which the prince found amusing. But he promised. Later, on the way by carriage, Emilione asked how Eloi managed to smile so easily at the king. She herself couldn't do it, even trying her hardest. Impossible. His Highness explained that he doesn't have the same status as the saint, so he must hide his emotions. Then he flirtatiously confessed that he couldn't do it in his first encounter with Emilione. Remembering how he attracted her attention the first time, the saint suspected he used Marquis Cheval. In reality, the reagent was a sweet aroma, so faint that only the saint could perceive it. Having said that, he took a lock of her hair and began to smell it, as if the aroma were still there. In their first encounter, The prince denied that it smelled sweet, and Emilione asked why. Their conversation had now turned into such mushiness that the high priest could no longer stay still. But he hid his jealousy, with suspicions that Prince Aloys approached the saint with bad intentions. His Highness, smiling, assured that he was not going to do anything bad to Emilione. On the contrary, he wanted to prove that to create the world she dreams of, he needs someone like him. Seeing how the situation smelled, Emilione asked Renee Ben to calm down. In any case, whatever the case, the plan is going quite well, so there is no need to worry. The high priest had no more objections, if everything seemed fine to the saint. The young woman wanted to smile at him, when suddenly she felt something rising in her throat. Her face took on a sickly hue, and along with the sudden mood change, frightened the men. Emilione grabbed her throat and rasped that she couldn't breathe, as if something were strangling her. The explanation for this phenomenon was that the saint felt the screams of the people of Beaumont. Now she began to understand why Ulwa had brought her, and tried to calm down. The high priest revered her, ready to help her at any moment. But then the carriage stopped, and His Highness explained that they had reached the slums. They waited another minute until the saint's breathing recovered. She was ready to go out and see the horror the prince had warned her about. Outside, the high priest was the first to be amazed. He thought they were in hell. In the dirty street there were ruined shacks, with people almost thrown down, so thin that their bones were visible. The air seemed impregnated with pain and suffering, causing the worst sensations. Seeing healthy people, a girl started to approach them, but her legs were so thin and weak that she barely took a few steps and started to fall. The saint caught her, feeling rage that someone dared to do that to a girl. The girl looked up and looked at the saint with sunken sockets, trying to say something. Her voice was also very weak, but she managed to ask if the woman was Sister Libera. Emilione explained that the girl was mistaken and that she was from the temple. It hurt her to see that emaciated body collapsing, so she used her divine power to make the girl feel better. The bruises and scratches visible under her old, tattered clothes began to disappear. The little girl's complexion also took on a healthier tone, and she felt a surge of energy. Realizing that this woman had healed her, the girl thanked her sincerely, and she asked Ulwa and Renaven to gather all those poor victims in one place. Moreover, they had to do it as quickly as possible. Time was running out. Emilione worked with those people for a whole week, almost without rest. Tiredness was evident on her, and the prince, worried, begged her to rest a little. But the saint couldn't ignore the sick, and there were still many outside. She asked Ulwa to stop chatting and help her bring them before her to heal them. Emilione was about to rest after healing the last patient, but suddenly everything started looking double, and she felt like she was going to stagger and fall. The last thing she saw was Prince Esse running towards her to support her, and then she felt herself falling into an empty space where there was only nothing. The prince managed to catch her and prepared to take her to the stretcher. Renaven heard her scream and rushed into the tent, realizing that something had happened to the saint. A moment later, the girl regained consciousness and asked them not to scold her, as she had only gotten dizzy. But the prince and the high priest disagreed, and insisted that the saint rest well before continuing to heal. Emilione wanted to know when the priests of the Kingdom of Beaumont would arrive. Renee Ben believed they were delayed on the way to the low quarters due to the entry prohibition, but he didn't doubt they would arrive soon. After that, the saint agreed to rest a little. Meanwhile, somewhere in the woods, around a campfire, hooded people were thinking about how to get rid of the saint while she was in the low quarters. Some doubted they could succeed, since she is under the protection of divine force. But one individual revealed a method to them that should undoubtedly work. The strangest thing for these guys was that he had ordered the murders to stop, and after meeting the saint, he had become strange. Because of this, now they must act more decisively, so that this man returns to his previous state. Behind them, from the darkness of the forest, a voice was heard announcing that this person was their sister. Veron came out to meet them, realizing that some dark mage had decided to attack the saint. Duke Nestro was not expected by these people, but he was an obstacle for them, and they decided to finish him off immediately. But Veron was already preparing to punish those who worship darkness, getting ready to apply the light of retribution. A blinding explosion razed the place where the villains were, but they managed to teleport just in time. Beorn observed the pieces of rock where those disgusting rats were sitting. He had a plan in mind. Later that night, Emilia sank into a deep sleep in a hut by candlelight. Prince Ulwa did not leave her bed, carefully monitoring her breathing. Suddenly, he heard the voice of his cousin, who entered so quietly that the prince got a chill. Turning around, he saw Beorn standing, leaning against the door frame, and asked what he was doing in the kingdom of Bamot. It turns out the duke came to deliver something. He took out an ancient medallion, round in shape, hanging from a long chain. It was an artifact that, not long ago, Prince Ulwa himself had requested they obtain. And upon receiving the object, Ulwa praised Beorn as the best mage in the empire. This thing will be very useful to the saint, but his praise sounded false to the duke. And he became curious why the saint looked so tired that she didn't even listen to their conversation. Upon learning that she had spent a whole week curing the sick, the duke was not surprised, as he always assumed such difficulties, and then he discreetly informed the prince that dark mages are trying to get rid of this girl. Moreover, it seemed strange to him that Ronla behaved as if she were going to regress. The reasons for this were unknown to him. However, he noticed that his sister started pursuing Ulwa and Emilione right after they left the capital, and he asked the prince to be alert. In any case, he was not going to stray far, and is ready to protect the saint at any moment. He would deal with his sister later, but Ulwa asked Veyron to return. And not to worry, he now has the artifact, and since he is here himself, he is sure that no one else can harm the saint. After some time, Emilione woke up and started healing the sick again. They were all lying on the floor on blankets, and she had to kneel to attend to them. Renee Ben occasionally asked how she felt, and she always assured him she was fine. But now it would be easier for her to work, as the priests of Bamot finally arrived. However, she was not happy to see them, as they took too long to get here. She didn't even want to hear their apologies, but they couldn't say anything more in their defense. Then Ulwa approached, announcing that the carriage was ready to go to the temple. Renaven asked her to leave calmly, and promised that he would settle everything with the priests. This reassured Emilione. She could trust the high priest, and asked him not to take too long. On the way, the prince confessed that he used the saint's name for several matters. But they were not bad. Emilione herself felt some relief. At first it seemed like it would never end, but now she is happy to see so many people healed. It turns out that all these people are just a small part of the kingdom's population. Then Ulwa took out some documents, and the saint became alert. The prince waited a long time to show her this, but he thought now was the right time. Emilione read what was written on the sheets attentively for a while, and couldn't believe it was all true. It turns out that the people of Bamot were victims of the luxury of the king and the nobility. The priests tried to protect the people, opposing the king, but their forces were not enough. In the end, on the condition that His Majesty would not interfere with the fate of half the people, the rest were managed to be protected in the temple. But those who were not protected by the temple were cruelly exploited in meaningless constructions and precious stone extraction. All this was due to the vanity of the king and the nobility, and under the pretext of supervising the works. The people suffered abuse. The villages near the mines turned into slums, and the priests were restricted from accessing these areas. Emilia still didn't understand how such horrors could happen in the land where the temple is located, and she decided that this night, in the name of the Holy Maiden, a trial would be held, a trial against King Bamot, and when he was summoned to the hall, the saint demanded that he plead guilty. That, for personal gain and not for the prosperity of the country, he had violently exploited the people. Asibio remained silent, head bowed, as if he had nothing to say. And when Emilia demanded an answer again, he angrily declared that he was not to blame for anything. He pretended it was the first time he had heard of the horrors occurring in the land where there is a temple. Seeing that this guy had no intention of giving up, Emilia asked Ulwa to hand her those documents, and she asked the king if he knew what those documents were. Asabian's face instantly changed in horror, as he believed those documents had been destroyed. The young woman continued, saying they bore the royal seal, which confirmed their authenticity. They state that, in exchange for protecting half the people, the king commits not to interfere with the fate of the rest. After quoting the lines, the saint furiously threw the documents towards His Majesty. He began to bluster that it was a conspiracy, and that someone had framed him for everything. But Emilione didn't believe him and didn't want to hear excuses, as she had seen everything herself. And from that moment, by her powers as a holy maiden, she ordered the deposition of King Bamot. The guards approached Asabian, preparing to take him to a cell, while he begged for mercy. At the same time, he was furious that the knights dared to touch the royal family, and he threatened them with death. What's more, he threatened the saint who rejected him, vowing she would pay for everything. That attitude only confirmed his guilt, condemning him to rot in prison. The king was quickly taken away, and silence finally reigned in the hall. There, on a bench among several witnesses, sat a blonde girl. Somehow, the saint knew she was Princess Libera Beaumont and called her to the front. The girl became uneasy, not understanding what was expected of her, but she obeyed the saint. The saint knew that Libera had been exiled years ago for her commoner origin to the outskirts. The girl blamed herself for not having the right blood, but what matters are actions. Moreover, there is a rumor that she tried to save the people and never stopped studying. Emilione learned all this thanks to the priests and the inhabitants of Beaumont. Without that girl, many people would have died. This country needs her. Emilia approached Libera and placed her hands on her shoulders. Then she begged her to be a just ruler and guide Beaumont onto the right path. In other words, Libera had to be the queen of the state she had defended. On that day, for the first time in history, a woman would rule the kingdom. Emilia crowned the princess, who, despite her origin, turned out to be the perfect candidate thanks to her brilliant intellect. After Libera's ascension, the saint had to leave, although she was a little sad. She had grown fond of the place, but she couldn't stay. She still had pending matters. Suddenly, she asked Ulwa what she should do when meeting aristocrats from other countries. The question to the prince seemed a bit foolish, but he advised her to act naturally. The girl thought about it, as this gave her the freedom to act as she pleased. Suddenly, the carriage in which the three of them were traveling shook violently and stopped. Everyone felt the jolt, but Renee Ben was most worried about whether the saint had been hurt. She was a little nervous, but generally fine. Prince Ulwa also hadn't suffered anything serious, and Emilione suggested going outside. There the coachman started apologizing to the saint, but she understood it wasn't his fault. Surely someone set a trap on the road with magic, so it is a planned attack. And while they were figuring out what was going on, a mysterious man was watching them from behind a tree. But the accident is not the worst thing that happened to them on the road. Suddenly, an arrow flew out of nowhere. It fell inside the carriage, but the saint's hand was slightly grazed. While Renee Ben tended to the wound, Ulwa challenged the attacker to come out of the bushes. Emilione suddenly felt dizzy. Although the arrow only grazed her, it probably had monster blood. Then, the three of them heard someone approaching from the thicket of the forest, and instantly, they saw several individuals with long robes and faces hidden under large hoods. The coachman panicked instantly, as if he knew what kind of shadowy figures they were. And Prince Ulwa understood that these were the dark mages Duke Varan had warned them about. They all immediately prepared their arrows to attack the travelers again. A huge number of arrows flew simultaneously towards the saint, and it seemed she had no chance of survival. But she did not intend to die, and using her divine power, she created a shield that stopped the arrows. And then, fury invaded her upon seeing that someone dared to challenge an envoy of the gods. The hooded figures were left wide-mouthed. They didn't believe she could block that attack. But Prince Aloys did not doubt his fiancée's power for a second. She narrowly dodged the first arrow. The ambush took her by surprise. Suddenly, dark energy enveloped Emilione, squeezing her tightly. The saint had difficulty moving, and then they lifted her up. Someone was using very powerful black magic. What was happening was like an attack by anti-divine mages. An abomination. They mocked. The saint, God's favorite, was falling before their attack. What irony. One was preparing for another attack, convinced that her strength was pure fiction. But Emilio insisted. They made a fatal mistake by showing themselves before her. The mage didn't understand why she kept babbling, instead of praying before dying. The saint realized that, after using divine punishment, she now had no strength left. Finally, Ulwa decided to help her. Who knows what he expected with Rebane? It turns out the prince prepared an artifact his cousin had given him. Clutching the pendant in his hand, Ulwa transformed it into a divine bow and drew an identical arrow, which flew straight at the leader of the villains and shattered the dark energy sphere he was holding. In that instant, the chains of dark magic holding the saint broke, and she began to fall. Although it wasn't from very high up, Renee Ben managed to catch her, worried that the dark energy might have seriously harmed her. In the high priest's arms, the saint opened her eyes and assured him she was fine. Now she was more worried that the enemies were still present. Those villains were shouting that it wasn't over yet, that God did not exist, and that they would destroy the saint's illusions. Freeing herself from Renee Ben's embrace, Emilione asked him and the prince to step aside. And knowing the high priest was going to object, she immediately asked him not to worry. She truly felt much better, and repeated that she was much stronger than Renee Ben thought. Then she turned towards that dark mage and decided to bet with him on the existence of God. His claim that God did not exist enraged her, and she began to concentrate energy like blue lightning in her hands. And then she directed this cluster towards the villain who dared to attack her and insult God. A bright flash occurred, and the villain's magic began to fade. They themselves had difficulty breathing, but their leader only got furious and ordered everyone to attack the saint again. But seeing that his subordinates were useless, he prepared to annihilate the saint himself. Now, Prince Eloi could easily deal with those whose magic had almost disappeared. He once again drew the string of the magic bow, made from an artifact, and shot the arrow. This time, the attack on the villains was more lethal, and their leader understood that there was a powerful artifact there that he alone could not handle. He ordered the survivors to retreat immediately. He looked at Emilione one last time, and his words that they would meet soon sounded like a curse. Instantly, the villains disappeared as if the earth had swallowed them, and Emilione kept looking there for a while. She couldn't understand who this person was who so longed to assassinate her. The prince saw that the saint longed for the truth, but now he couldn't help her with that in any way. When Duke Veron came to see him, he asked the prince not to tell the saint anything about Ronal for now. And now he only consoled Emilione with words, telling her that someday they would find the villain. And he asked her to take care of herself now, as the battle against the dark mages had been very dangerous. The important thing is that everything ended, but the saint was once again lost in her thoughts. After all, they had to travel by boat again, and Emilione was invaded by a crisis of nausea. She has to fight seasickness again, and it seemed to her that this was her worst enemy. In this situation, not even sacred power helped, but the girl tried to stay strong. Seeing how the prince cared for her all the time, Emilione asked him to rest too, but the boy didn't feel very tired. Moreover, for a bastard like him, death is always lurking. He got used to not sleeping at night, watching the surroundings to survive. It is surprising that the saint found out about his difficult childhood only now, but he simply didn't want to show his weakness to her. Eloi had to try hard to protect himself, and he fought detractors almost like Emilione is doing now. For a moment, their gazes met and silence fell, allowing them to enjoy each other's aura. But a new wave of nausea prevented it, and even the saint felt a bit uncomfortable. To distract her, Eloi told her that they would now go to a place where she could easily please his fiancé. At the same time, he asked her not to think anything bad, but to trust him and enjoy herself. The saint did not object, but for some reason, his words about enjoying herself made her doubtful. Soon they arrived at a place very popular with high-ranking aristocrats. Eloi suggested they change clothes, as the priest's attire would stand out too much. He led the saint and the others to a room so they could rest while other outfits were brought. The room turned out to be much cozier than Emilione expected. The armchairs were quite soft, and the saint offered René Ben a little rest while the prince returned. However, the high priest refused, as they did not know the country and he had to stay close to the saint. Evidently, he was still tense after that attack in Beaumont, and the saint understood his concern. But rest was necessary, and she begged him to sit down and relax, stating she would feel guilty if he worked without rest. Emilione touched his head and asked him to save his strength for a more important moment. The high priest blushed a little and was about to say something to the saint when suddenly the door behind them burst open, and Eloi entered with a box in his hands. He himself was wearing a uniform that suited his destiny well, and Emilione understood that they would have to pretend to be high-ranking aristocrats. This didn't cheer her up much, and then the prince handed her a box with clothes for her. The girl looked attentively and couldn't believe Eloi wanted her to wear that. In the late afternoon, after resting, the three went out onto the street for a look. Passers-by kept turning to look at them, but they didn't say a word. The saint supposed their appearance was very strange. She had an off-the-shoulder dress, a fur stole, and a white wig. It was clear that this way she looked more like a companion girl, but the prince assured that there was nothing wrong with the outfit. And so that the saint would stop worrying, he leaned towards her and declared that, regardless of her appearance, she would always be beautiful, especially to him. But Emilia wasn't asking about appearance for that reason. She was worried that nothing too revealing was showing. They have now reached the residential area of the port, but very soon the prince will take the saint to a place where she can easily relieve her fatigue. After walking a couple more blocks, they approached a building where two guards were watching the entrance. The guards immediately prepared to drive out the intruders, but Eloi approached, and in a calm and assured voice, He declared that he was there by invitation of the burning butterfly. The guards looked at each other. Obviously, that was the password for entry. And before the prince and the saint, the doors opened, behind which there was a stone staircase leading down. Going down, they reached a wide lobby with many doors. Ulwa asked his companion to wear a mask, as guests must keep their secrets. Now she understood why she had to dress up like this. The outfit and the mask completely hid her identity. Then they entered the hall, where there were several gaming tables and small sofas for resting. Emilione, curiously, began to look around. All those present are high-ranking nobles who are having fun without distinguishing day from night, intoxicated by money. Very soon, a croupier approached the new visitors. Even despite her disguise, he knew it was her first time there. The prince objected, claiming that he had been there several times with his father. Moreover, he requested unusual entertainments for today and asked to be taken to the Rose Room. Probably, these were also some keywords, by which the croupier took him for a very important guest. And immediately he began to accompany them to that room. While on the way, Emilione kept looking around. She even thought that if there were a gaming hall in the capital, it would look exactly the same. They were led to a gaming table and wished them an enjoyable game. The saint felt the fervor, confessing that in the temple they called her the Queen of Games. A guy wearing a dog mask understood that they had a new guest, the prince. Then he started mocking him, calling him foolish for bringing his girl to this place. Emilione replied that their relationship was no one's business, least of all that Cretan's. Right after, she found a seat and proclaimed that she had come to play. The lady with the rabbit mask found her very bold, but said they didn't play with rookies. Moreover, she supposed the newcomer only brought a few coins to try her luck. Suddenly, Ulwa placed some papers on the table, expecting them to serve as the bet. Emilione checked the documents and confirmed that this was exactly what they needed. Then she addressed the croupier, asking which game he preferred, surprising the other players a little. The croupier gave Emilione the right to choose, and she requested a common card game. Poker. Some of those seated at the table smiled maliciously, believing that this girl would lose in the first round. And she took the cards and immediately got an ace and a two of clubs, showing a complacent smile on her face. And confident, she placed all her chips in the center of the table and declared that she was betting everything she currently possessed. That is, the ownership rights to the western part of the kingdom of Ez. Some looked at her like an idiot, and others decided to withdraw immediately, so as not to witness that shame. But the man masked with a crow's beak even liked it. He was sure that he would beat the novice. He didn't care what lineage she was from, but he threatened. If she underestimated him, he wouldn't leave so easily. Some time later, the third round was already underway. Emilione threw the cards on the table again, and it was evident she had won once more. The man with the crow mask apparently forgot that luck smiles on newcomers, or the saint has a special gift. She herself was happy and mentally calculated how much she had won in such a short time. At the same time, she mocked the veteran who had threatened her recently for losing again. But then he, furious, jumped up and spat on the chips, saying that if the novice player wishes, she can try to take that money. Emilione slowly stood up, as if waiting for this idiot to start the fight first. She threw the chips on the floor and approaching him, declared that she was willing to return all the money, but only if he begged her on his knees and collected them in that same position in front of her. He must decide before she changes her mind. The man, believing that no one would recognize him like that, began to collect chips, with Emily standing over him. She felt pleasure in having humiliated one of the aristocrats. Then she became curious to know where Ulwa would take her, but he asked her to choose the game. At that moment, a lady approached and proposed playing with her. Although her face was partially covered by a mask, her wrinkles revealed that she was older. Emily accepted her invitation immediately, and they headed to another table. After some time, the saint kept winning again and again, and even started getting bored. She couldn't wait for Ulwa to satisfy her at last. The prince asked her to wait a little longer. At the next table, a croupier with a white uniform that stood out among her colleagues approached. A nobleman was sitting there who had won 10 times in a row, and no one dared to bet more. Emilione noted the commotion and became curious to know what was happening there. A game led by a girl in white was about to start, in which it is difficult to win. Normally, but the saint had already settled her backside at that table and declared that she wanted to play. The croupier greeted her and then pointed to a gentleman who had bet a Nervetian olive tree. Upon hearing about that tree, Emilione became a little thoughtful. It symbolizes the goddess Myrtio, as well as the prosperity and peace of the kingdom of Nervidio. It is a very valuable and rare tree. There are only a few in the temple of the empire. While the saint tried to understand how it had fallen into the hands of this guy, the croupier again asked what the newcomer would bet. And since the man had bet an olive tree, the girl decided to bet a parola flower. The player was in shock. It is rumored that this flower was born from the tears of the god Pearl. It is an extremely rare species, even in its land. But Emilione claims to have documents proving it. The croupier took the documents the saint offered her and confirmed that it was a valuable bet. Only Prince Eloi doubted. He didn't think it was worth risking that flower. However, Emilione was sure she would win, and she looked at the prince with a look that made him feel guilty, and he apologized for speaking without thinking. The player understood that his competitor was from an influential lineage by deciding to bet that flower, and he didn't consider himself foolish enough to lose to some random noblewoman. Emilione stared at him for a few seconds and then smiled and declared that he was indeed that foolish. He dared to plant an olive tree. If a saint found out, he was going to get a good talking to. But now, while he was getting angry at the girl's insult, it was time to play with the symbols of the gods. It seemed that cultural heritage was at stake, and Emilione was going to recover it. Composing himself, the player proposed to his rival that she choose the game. And then she proposed something unexpected, placing on the table a chest that who knows where she had been hiding. The game consisted of answering all questions with the truth, and the saint was already licking her lips. The chest was a magical instrument to detect liars, and the first one to lie would lose. The man became furious again. She wanted to use an untested magical instrument. That was not fair, but the saint reminded him that he himself had given her the right to choose the game. Now it seemed he was not going to keep his word. He had no choice but to accept the proposed game, grinding his teeth. With an annoyed tone, he asked the croupier in white to start, wanting to finish soon. Emilione decided to be the first to question him. It seems he is plotting something again. And the player asked her a stupid question, if she was sure of winning that silly game. With her hand on the chest, the saint answered affirmatively with complete certainty. Now it was her turn to ask, and she remembered that masks hide identity. But if she found out the origin of that man, his identity would be almost revealed. And she demanded to know if he was an aristocrat from the kingdom of Nervidio. The man was shocked, not understanding how she knew, but admitted to being one. The next question was even stranger. She wanted to know if the guy next to him was his lover. The player supposed that this lady had a bad relationship with her husband. Probably he wanted to move on to random attacks, but the saint just said she didn't have a husband. The croupier took her words as an answer, and it was her turn to ask again. The saint knows that in Nervidio every year, those who guard the harsh lands of Ardua are given an olive tree. She didn't have to think long to formulate her next question, which implied that her opponent was a noble guard of House Ardua. This time the man became so enraged that he stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair, and he accused the lady of not knowing the limits of the game, those that should not be crossed. But the croupier stopped him, explaining that aggressive behavior could be considered a defeat. Moreover, if he does not comply with the conditions of the bet, he will have to compensate his opponent 5 times over. This only exasperated the player further, who threw the document onto the table and admitted defeat furiously. The guy got up from the table, and Prince Eloi was curious how the saint knew all that. She noticed a stone in his ring, which is only mined in Ardua. Furthermore, the sword masters of Nervidio are distinguished by the location of their calluses, and because of that, he was an easy opponent. At that moment, a croupier approached and asked the guests if they had ever been to the Red Sea. The prince admitted he had been there, and understood they were suggesting they go now. Emilione noticed how the ladies were whispering that these people, after all, were going to the Red Sea, and she felt an almost unbearable curiosity to know what that place was. The saint and the prince followed the croupier and arrived at a door that was locked. The croupier turned the key several times. Behind the door, another spiral stone staircase descended, and the dealer asked them to follow her. He begged them to watch where they stepped, as the lighting was very dim in that place. The deeper they went down, the stronger that unpleasant smell became for Emilione, the one she has been smelling lately. Watch out, don't even think about someone farting out of fear. Eloi noticed the saint's unease, and she explained that she was worried about the smell, which intensified as they went down to the basement. And when it became quite distinct, the dealer announced that they had arrived. The woman pointed to a door that the guests had to open and enter by themselves. She herself decided to leave them, which further awakened Emilione's curiosity. His Highness took the doorknob, assuming that the source of the smell the saint perceived was there. And upon opening the door, they saw a common hall, with several beds and people connected to IV drips on them. This place smelled like the laboratory where they experiment on people. The prince explained that in war they need noble blood and look for compatible people. And this place is for trading blood. They collect it and call it red seed.